There is a moment in season 7 where Homer discovers his lifelong dream was written on a piece of paper at his very first job. He opens it. The dream was to work at the nuclear power plant, the place he has always hated, the place he ended up anyway. The show says nothing, it just lets that sit there. No show on television was doing that in 1992. At its peak, The Simpsons was not just the best animated show ever made, it was the most honest portrait of ordinary American life that television had ever produced. And then season by season, it stopped being that so gradually that most people cannot point to exactly when it happened, only that something essential was gone. Today I want to show you exactly how. The writers who left. The one episode that broke the show's relationship with its audience permanently. The slow collapse of every character from a real person into a single repeated joke. And the moment a show that used to tell the truth about real life stopped trying. All 35 seasons, every major turning point. This is how The Simpsons gets worse every season. Welcome to Yellow Fan. Subscribing is free and it helps more than you know. Let's begin. The Golden Age defined what the show actually was at its peak. Seasons 3 to 8. Before you can understand how The Simpsons got worse every season, you have to understand what it actually was when it was good. Not what people say it was, not the version that lives in memes and merchandise and the cultural memory of a generation that grew up on it. What it actually was, episode by episode, scene by scene, week by week, during the years it was operating at its best. Because the show that exists today and the show that existed between 1991 and 1997 are not the same show. They share a title, a family, a town, a theme song. Everything else is different, and the distance between those two versions of The Simpsons is the entire story this video is going to tell. The Golden Age of The Simpsons ran from season 3 through season 8. That is roughly 178 episodes, spanning the years 1991 to 1997. During that stretch, the show produced some of the most precisely written, emotionally intelligent, and genuinely funny television that has ever existed. Not just in animation, in any form of television, full stop. IMDb ratings for episodes from those seasons cluster between 7.5 and 9.0. Many individual episodes, the ones that fans return to again and again, sit well above that. The numbers are just one way of confirming what anyone who has watched those seasons already knows in their gut. Something was happening in that writer's room that almost never happens, and it did not last. To understand what made those seasons work, you have to start with the viewing numbers, because the numbers tell a story that is easy to miss if you only look at the decline. The Simpsons premiered in 1989. Its second season opened with an episode called Bart Gets an F, in which Bart fails a history test and has to study through the night only to fail anyway, but by a single point because he can correctly identify one event related to a snow day. The episode ends with Bart crying at his desk and then realizing it has actually snowed outside. That is the entire story. A kid fails a test, cries, then the weather changes. That episode drew 33.6 million viewers. It remains the most watched episode in the show's entire history. More people watched a cartoon about a boy failing a history test than watched almost any other television broadcast that week. And they did not watch it because it was loud or outrageous or because it promised them something shocking. They watched it because the show had, in its first season and a half, already proven that it understood something about American family life that most television was either ignoring or pretending did not exist. Early seasons of the show averaged over 20 million viewers per episode. That figure is almost impossible to comprehend from where the show sits now, but in the early 1990s, 20 million viewers meant The Simpsons was not just a popular show, it was a cultural event that the entire country was participating in at the same time, every week. Then President George H.W. Bush gave a speech in 1992 in which he said America needed to be more like the Waltons and less like The Simpsons. The show's response aired shortly after. Bart, watching Bush's speech on television, said the family was just like the Waltons because they were both praying for an end to the Depression too. That exchange, a sitting president attacking an animated series, and the animated series hitting back with a joke that landed harder than the attack, tells you more about what the show was during its peak than any ratings chart. So what was actually happening inside those episodes that made them work the way they worked? correct. The first thing to understand is that the golden age of The Simpsons was not built on jokes, it was built on character. This distinction sounds simple, but it explains almost everything about why the show's decline happened the way it did. In seasons 3 through 8, every story started with a question about one of the members of the Simpson family, what they wanted, what they feared, what they were refusing to admit about themselves. The jokes came out of the characters being themselves in a specific situation. They were not decoration placed on top of a plot, they were the plot. Season 7 produced an episode called Mother Simpson. The basic story is straightforward. Homer discovers his mother, who he was told had died when he was young, is actually alive and has been in hiding for decades. She is a former activist who destroyed a germ warfare laboratory that belonged to Mr. Burns, and Burns has been hunting her ever since. She comes back into Homer's life for a few days, then she has to flee again, and Homer watches her go. The final scene of that episode is Homer sitting on the hood of his car in the driveway, alone, looking up at the stars. He says nothing. The camera holds on him. The episode ends. That scene has been called by Bill Oakley, who ran the show as co-showrunner during seasons 7 and 8 alongside Josh Weinstein. The one moment from his time on the show that still gets to him. A grown man watching his mother's taillights disappear in the dark, then sitting outside in the quiet because going back inside does not feel like something he knows how to do yet. There is no joke at the end of it. The show just lets it be what it is. That kind of scene was not rare during the Golden Age, it was the standard. Season 2 gave Lisa a substitute teacher named Mr. Bergstrom, played by Dustin Hoffman under a fake name because Hoffman was not sure he wanted his name associated with a cartoon. The episode is about Lisa developing a connection with a teacher who actually sees her, who treats her intelligence and sensitivity as real things worthy of attention rather than inconveniences to be managed. When Mr. Bergstrom has to leave Springfield, he gives Lisa a note. She opens it later. It reads, "You are Lisa Simpson," 4 words. The episode does not explain why that matters. It does not need to. The reason Dustin Hoffman appeared under a pseudonym matters here. In 1991, a major film actor agreeing to do a voice on an animated television series was not obvious. It was not something people expected. Hoffman agreed because the material was worth his time, because the episode was asking him to do something genuinely difficult, not just read funny lines into a microphone. Michael Jackson appeared in season 3 as a large white man in a psychiatric facility who believes he is Michael Jackson. And the episode is structured specifically to puncture celebrity worship rather than celebrate it. Danny DeVito played Homer's long-lost half-brother in season 2, and the episode used that premise to examine class, resentment, and what it actually costs a person to find out that the family member they imagined is better than them is Homer Simpson. Every one of those guest appearances served the story. Not one of them was the story. That difference will matter a great deal later in this video. The second thing that defined the Golden Age was the writer's room. Al Jean and Mike Rice ran seasons 3 and 4, and John himself has said that he believes this is one of the main reasons those seasons are considered the best the show ever produced. They had the foundation already in place from the first 2 seasons, and they were building on it rather than figuring it out. When they left to create their own show, David Merkin took over for seasons 5 and 6, and brought with him a sense of humor that pushed the show towards slightly more surreal territory while keeping the family dynamics intact. Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein ran seasons 7 and 8, and their 2 seasons represent something close to the final distillation of everything the show could do. Grounded emotion, sharp satire, absurdist comedy, and genuine warmth all operating in the same episode at the same time, without any of those things canceling the others out. The people in that room were working 12-hour days. They worked weekends. They pushed each other through multiple drafts of every script. The standard was not what was good enough. The standard was what was actually right. Writer burnout was high because the bar never came down. That level of collective effort sustained over 6 seasons is not something that happens by accident, and it is not something that can be replaced by a different group of people told to do a similar thing. Season 5 produced Cape Fear, widely considered one of the greatest episodes of the show. Sideshow Bob, voiced by Kelsey Grammer, stalks the Simpson family. The entire third act of the episode is structured around a single joke. Bob, trying to murder Bart, is repeatedly interrupted by having to perform the entirety of the HMS Pinafore for an audience of one because Bart asks him to. The joke lasts several minutes. It should not work at all. It works completely because by that point in the show's run, the audience understood exactly what Kelsey Grammer brought to Sideshow Bob. The theatrical self-regard, the complete inability to resist an audience even in the middle of committing a felony. And the episode understood that too and built around it. Season 6 gave us Homer at the wheel of a car driving into a lake while talking to himself about all the ways the day has gone wrong. Season 7 gave us Homer discovering that his lifelong dream had been printed on a piece of paper and placed in a sealed envelope at his first job, and that the dream was to work at the nuclear power plant, which is where he ended up anyway. Season 8 gave us Homer's Enemy, in which a competent, hardworking man named Frank Grimes arrives at the nuclear plant and is driven slowly insane by the fact that Homer's obvious incompetence and bad luck somehow produce a comfortable life, while Grimes's genuine effort produces nothing. The episode ends with Grimes dying because Homer's casual stupidity goads him into grabbing live electrical wires. At the funeral, Homer falls asleep and starts laughing in his sleep. The mourners laugh along with him. That episode has been analyzed more than almost any other in the show's history because it sits right at the edge of the golden age and points toward what is coming. It is the first episode that shows the show becoming uncomfortable with Homer, asking for the first time on purpose whether someone like Homer should be rewarded in the way the show keeps rewarding him. Frank Grimes is the audience member who has been watching for 8 seasons, noticing all the ways Homer should have faced real consequences and never did. The fact that Homer's Enemy exists at all, that the show wrote it, produced it, aired it, tells you how much creative confidence the writer's room had during those years. The show was secure enough in what it was to spend 22 minutes questioning whether what it was should continue to exist. You can only do that when the foundation is completely solid. The show spent the rest of its run proving that it was not, in fact, that solid, that the confidence of the Golden Age was specific to a specific group of people at a specific moment in the show's history, and that removing those people would change the show in ways no one had fully prepared for. Quote _0 __, because almost all of those people were about to leave. And the story of why they left and what was lost when they did is the real beginning of the decline that this video is about. Section 2, The Writer's Room Exodus, Why the People Mattered More Than the Format. There is a version of the Simpsons decline story that blames the format. The argument goes something like this: the show ran too long, the ideas ran out. You can only tell so many stories about the same family in the same town before the well goes dry. That version of the story is comfortable because it does not require anyone to be responsible for anything. Long-running shows get worse. It happens. Move on. That version is wrong, or rather, it is incomplete in a way that lets the most important part of the story disappear. The Simpsons did not get worse because it ran out of format. It got worse because the specific people who made it extraordinary left one by one over a period of roughly 4 years, and the people who replaced them were not operating with the same set of instincts, the same creative standards, or the same shared understanding of what the show was supposed to be doing. The format stayed, the family stayed, Springfield stayed, the writer's room changed completely, and the show changed with it, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily and permanently in ways that became impossible to ignore by the time season 10 arrived. To understand what was lost, you have to understand who was there during the years the show was at its best. Conan O'Brien joined the writing staff in 1991 after leaving Saturday Night Live. He stayed for 2 seasons, seasons 4 and 5, and while working on season 5, he received a phone call offering him the hosting chair for late night. He took it and left. In his 2 seasons on the show, he received writing credit on 3 episodes. New Kid on the Block, Marge versus the Monorail, and Homer Goes to College. Marge versus the Monorail from Season 4 was named the 4th best episode of The Simpsons ever made by Entertainment Weekly in 2003. The episode is about a con man who sells a useless monorail to Springfield, and Homer ends up as the conductor of a runaway train. It works because O'Brien built the entire story around a specific type of human foolishness, the way a crowd will follow a smooth talker off a cliff if he sings a catchy enough song, and then let Homer's specific brand of accidental heroism resolve it. The joke density in that episode, the precision of every line, the structure of the musical number in the middle of it, all of that reflects a sensibility that left the show the moment O'Brien got on a plane to New York. Greg Daniels joined the show in the early 1990s. He went on to co-develop King of the Hill and later adapted The Office for American television. His time on The Simpsons overlapped with some of its best seasons. David X. Cohen, who at the time was credited as David's Cohen, was a writer during the Golden Age and went on to co-create Futurama with Matt Groening. Brad Bird worked on the show during its golden era and later directed The Incredibles and Mission Impossible: Ghost Protocol. Jennifer Crittenden wrote for seasons 6 and 7 and went on to write for Seinfeld, Everybody Loves Raymond. And Veep. Dan McGrath was part of the room during the strongest years and left when most of the others did. None of these people left because the show collapsed. They left while the show was still good, or just as it was starting to turn. They left because their own careers were pulling them toward other things, better opportunities, their own projects, the natural movement of people who are good enough at their jobs that the rest of the industry wants them. The show could not hold them, and the show was not built to hold them. The writer's room had always operated on a rotation. People came in, worked for a few seasons, and moved on. What made seasons 3 through 8 extraordinary was that an unusually large concentration of genuinely talented people happened to arrive and overlap at the same time, and for a few years, they pushed each other to do something that none of them could have done alone. Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein had been writing together since the 8th grade. They ran the show as co-showrunners during seasons 7 and 8, 2 seasons that are regularly cited by critics and fans as the final consistent stretch of the Golden Age. Oakley has described the 3rd season of the show as the best thing that ever appeared on television. Under his and Weinstein's watch, the show produced Mother Simpson, Homer the Great, 22 short films about Springfield, and You Only Move Twice, the episode in which Homer works for a supervillain named Hank Scorpio, who is genuinely cheerful and supportive as a boss, while also trying to take over the world. When Oakley and Weinstein left after season 8, they took with them the last reliable institutional memory of what the Golden Age had been built on. When Mike Scully took over as showrunner at the start of season 9, he inherited a writing room that had just lost not only Oakley and Weinstein, but also David X. Cohen, Greg Daniels, Dan McGrath, Brad Bird, and several others who had been central to the show's best years. One profile of the show summarized the situation plainly. Scully faced a mass exodus of the writers who had sustained the show over the most recent stretch of greatness, and the show's ability to replenish itself after this second major wave of departures could not match what had happened earlier. The first major exodus, and the one that happened after season 4 when Al Jean and Mike Rice left, along with several others, had been survived because David Merkin and then Oakley and Weinstein were there to absorb it and maintain the standard. There was no equivalent safety net the second time. This is not an unfair criticism of Scully personally. He was, by multiple accounts from people who worked under him, a good manager of the room. Writer Tom Martin described him as quite possibly the best boss he had ever worked for. Don Payne noted that Scully cared about maintaining reasonable working hours for his staff. These are real qualities. They are just not the qualities that made seasons 3 through 8 great. What made those seasons great was a group of people who were unreasonable about quality, who worked 12-hour days and weekends, who pushed scripts through draft after draft because the previous version was not good enough yet, who operated under a shared understanding that the bar was as high as it could possibly go and that coming in below it was not acceptable. That kind of collective pressure is not sustainable indefinitely, and it is not something a showrunner can manufacture by telling people to work harder. It exists exists when the right people are in the same room at the same time, and each of them is raising the standard for the others. When those people leave, the pressure leaves with them. The statistical evidence for this is as close to definitive as you can get with something as subjective as comedy writing. Researcher Nathan Kuhn analyzed IMDb ratings across the show's entire run, tracking scores by writer and looking at when the collective quality began to fall. His finding was that if every writer wrote a perfectly average episode every single time they were credited, the show would have begun declining around its 200th episode, which lands almost exactly at the boundary of Season 8 and Season 9. The Golden Age, by Kuhn's statistical measure, spanned 214 episodes. Friends, which ran for 10 seasons and felt like it was on television forever, produced 236 episodes in total. The Simpsons sustained a golden age nearly as long as the entire run of one of the most successful television comedies ever made. And then it ended, and the data shows that it ended precisely when the people who produced it stopped being the ones writing it. The writers who topped Kuhn's per-episode quality rankings were Oakley and Weinstein, who co-wrote every episode they were credited on and averaged the highest IMDb scores of any writing pair in the show's history. Below them were the other writers from the core Golden Age period, the people whose instincts and sensibilities shaped the standard the room was working toward. The writers who joined later, even talented ones, could not replicate those numbers. This was not because they were bad writers, it was because the room they were joining was not the same room. The culture of relentless high standards that the founding generation had built was a living thing that required those specific people to maintain it, and once they were gone, it gradually softened into something more normal. There is one departure that deserves specific attention because it happened before the Golden Age was fully established, and its effects were felt throughout everything that followed. Sam Simon co-created The Simpsons alongside Matt Groening and James L. Brooks. His role in shaping the show during its first 2 seasons was enormous. He was the one who turned The Simpsons from a collection of animated shorts into a writer-driven show where the scripts were the foundation of everything else. The animation served the writing, the performances served the writing. The entire production process was organized around getting the writing right, and that was Simon's philosophy enforced from the top. He left after season 2 following what multiple accounts describe as a severe and bitter falling out with the other producers over creative and financial matters. He received a producer credit for years afterward due to the terms of his departure, but his active involvement ended when he left. The show survived Simon's departure because the writers he had helped assemble were still there and still operating according to the standard he had established. But his departure marked the beginning of a pattern that would define the show's entire history. The people most essential to its identity were never going to stay forever, and every time one of them left, something specific and unrepeatable left with them. By the time season 9 began in 1997, the writing room that Scully inherited was not the writing room that had produced Cape Fear or Mother Simpson or Marge versus the Monorail. It was a room that had been told to make The Simpsons by people who had grown up watching The Simpsons, staffed with writers who understood the show as an audience member understands it rather than as a creator understands it. The difference between those two kinds of understanding is the difference between knowing what a great episode of The Simpsons feels like and knowing how to make one. Knowing what it feels like is easier, making one is almost impossibly hard, and the people who knew how to do it had moved on. The show's long-term stagnation is partly explained by what happened next. Rather than cycling in new talent aggressively, the writer's room gradually became static. By the mid-2000s, most of the show's regular writing staff had joined between 1998 and 2002 and stayed there. The same people in the same room for decade after decade. The 2 newest full-time additions as of the 2000s had joined in 2015. What had once been a room defined by regular infusions of new voices and perspectives became something closer to a closed system. Writers who knew the show deeply but had no external creative life pulling them in other directions, no competition from the outside world forcing them to raise their game. The rotating high-pressure room of the Golden Age had become a comfortable institution. John Ortved, in his detailed history of the show, wrote something about this that has stuck with fans and critics for years. He said that blaming any single showrunner for the decline is unfair, that whoever was at the helm when the second major wave of talent left was always going to be holding the wheel when the ship changed course. The direction changed not because of one person's decisions, but because the people who had been pointing the show in the right direction were no longer there to do it. The ship turned because the best navigators had gotten off. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What nobody fully understood at the time was how permanent that turn would be. The assumption for years was that the show would find its footing again, that new talent would arrive, that the room would regenerate, that whatever had been lost in the transition from Oakley and Weinstein to Scully and eventually to Al Jean would be recovered or replaced. That assumption turned out to be wrong, but before the slow slide of the later seasons began in earnest, the show produced one episode that most people who study this period point to as the clearest early warning sign that something had fundamentally changed. It aired on September 28, 1997. It was the second episode of season 9, and the anger it generated from fans, from critics, and from the show's own cast members has never fully died down. Section 3, Homer's transformation from lovable oaf to jerkass. There is a specific moment in season 7 of The Simpsons where Homer, having accidentally gotten a crayon lodged in his brain removed, becomes measurably smarter. His IQ goes up, he starts reading books, he connects with Lisa in a way he never has before, and then, because the intelligence is making him miserable and isolating him from everyone around him, he asks to have the crayon put back. The doctor does it. Homer goes back to being Homer. That episode works because it operates on a real emotional truth. Homer's limitations are not just a running joke. They are part of who he is, and the show treats them with a kind of tenderness. He is not stupid in a way that is purely comic. He is stupid in a way that is human. The way a person can be intellectually limited and still be the emotional center of the people around him, still be loved, still be worth something. The crayon episode asks whether Homer would be better off smarter, and answers honestly, not necessarily. Not if smarter means alone. That version of Homer, the one the show was capable of treating with that kind of care, started disappearing around season 9. What replaced him has a name. Fans coined it themselves, pulled it from a line Homer shouts at strangers in a season 9 episode. They called it Jerkass Homer. And understanding exactly what changed and why is essential to understanding the larger story of how The Simpsons lost its way. Homer Simpson was never a perfect man. That was the point from the beginning. He was lazy, not particularly smart, often selfish, sometimes cruel to his son, regularly disappointing to his wife and daughter. The show did not pretend otherwise. The difference between the Homer of seasons 3 through 8 and the Homer who emerged after that is not that one was flawed and the other was not. Both were flawed. The difference is what the show did with the flaws. In the Golden Age, Homer's failures meant something. They had weight. When he let Bart down, the episode acknowledged it. When he was selfish toward Marge, the story eventually required him to reckon with it. The flaws were part of a complete person, a person the show took seriously enough to make face consequences, to make grow, at least a little, at least temporarily. The emotional mechanics of the Golden Age depended on this. You needed to believe that Homer cared about his family even when he was behaving badly, because that care was the engine that made the stories mean anything. By season 10 and 11, the care had been progressively replaced by something else. Homer was yelling at strangers for no reason. He was lying to and stealing from his own family, and the episode was not treating this as something requiring resolution. He was physically reckless in ways that were not funny but unpleasant, full of a mean energy that the earlier seasons had never leaned into. The word that keeps appearing in fan discussions from this period and in critical writing about the show is the same one. Mean. Not sharp, not dark, mean. There is a difference between a comedy that is willing to go dark places and a comedy that has simply become unkind. And The Simpsons in its post-Golden Age years crossed that line repeatedly without seeming to notice. The term jerkass Homer is not just fan slang. It is a documented, acknowledged phenomenon. Mike Rice, one of the original showrunners who ran the show during seasons 3 and 4, wrote about it directly in his book Springfield Confidential. His words on the subject were straightforward. He said that sometimes the fans get it right and that they are especially sensitive when the writing makes Homer too mean. He acknowledged that the fans called this jerk-ass Homer and that the people in the room heard it and tried to respond. The evidence across the seasons that followed suggests the response was inconsistent at best. The most precise description of what changed comes from looking at specific episodes side by side. Season 3 has an episode called When Flanders Failed. In it, Ned Flanders opens a store for left-handed people. Homer, driven by jealousy and spite, wishes for the store to fail and actively checks on it to confirm it is going poorly. He is pleased when it does badly. But when the store finally closes and the Flanders family is left with nothing, Homer is not pleased anymore. The satisfaction evaporates. He helps Ned get his house and his store back. The episode requires Homer to feel the ugliness of what he has been doing and to act against it. Season 9 has an episode called Trash of the Titans, in which Homer gets into a conflict with the city's garbage collectors after being rude to them. He refuses to apologize. He campaigns for and wins the position of sanitation commissioner on a promise of unlimited garbage pickup, implements a wildly irresponsible policy, fills the entire town with trash, and the episode resolves with Springfield being physically relocated to another site. Homer suffers no meaningful consequence. The episode is not interested in Homer reckoning with his behavior. It is interested in the spectacle of his behavior. And the spectacle alone, that is the core difference. When Flanders Failed is a story about Homer doing something selfish and then being confronted with what that selfishness costs. Trash of the Titans is a story about Homer being selfish and chaotic, and then the show finds a creative reset button so none of it has to matter. The first version requires the show to care about Homer as a person. The second version only requires the show to find Homer entertaining as a character, which is a fundamentally easier and fundamentally less interesting standard to meet. The show's own writers were aware of this, at least partially. In Season 7, the 138th episode Spectacular was a clip show that included a fake letter from a professor writing in to say he thought Homer got stupider every year. The show's response was to show a montage of Homer being increasingly idiotic and let the audience decide for themselves. It was a joke, but it was also the show hanging a sign on a real problem and then not addressing it. The self-awareness was there. The willingness to actually correct course was not. The man who ran the show during the years when Homer's transformation was most dramatic was Mike Scully, showrunner from seasons 9 through 12. The shift toward Homer as the center of almost every plot, Homer in absurd scenarios, Homer with new jobs and bizarre misadventures, Homer as the engine of chaos rather than the heart of a family, happened on his watch. The explanation that is circulated most widely is structural. By season 10, the show had already produced well over 200 episodes. The writers had already told most of the straightforward family stories. To generate new material, they needed Homer to be in situations that the earlier seasons had not put him in, which meant situations further and further from the grounded Springfield of the Golden Age. Those situations required a Homer with less conscience and more volatility, someone who could plausibly do outrageous things without the episode needing to spend time on whether that was the right call. Scully himself, in a 2007 interview about the show's longevity, made a joke that landed harder than he probably intended. When asked how the series kept going year after year, he said the answer was to lower your quality standards, because once you did that, you could go on forever. He was joking. But the joke described something real about what had happened to Homer and to the show around him. Homer's transformation did not happen in isolation. The entire Simpson family shifted in ways that reflected the same underlying pressure. Bart, who had been the breakout character of the show's first season, a genuinely unpredictable kid with a real internal life, capable of real mischief but also real feeling, became progressively more one-note as the seasons went on. The episodes that took Bart seriously as a character became rarer. Lisa, who in the Golden Age was a complex child struggling with intelligence and sensitivity in an environment that did not know what to do with either, gradually became the show's vehicle for delivering political and social opinions. Her emotional life contracted, her function expanded. Marge, who had always occupied the difficult position of the moral anchor in a family that regularly ignored her, became progressively less visible as an independent character and more of a reactive presence, someone who was there to respond to Homer's latest disaster rather than to have her own story. In the Golden Age, the show produced episodes that were genuinely about Marge, her art, her gambling problem, her experience of being overlooked by a husband who took her for granted. Those episodes treated her inner life as material worth spending time on. The later seasons did this far less consistently. What all of these changes have in common is a shift away from people and toward types. The Golden Age gave you Homer Simpson, a specific, recognizable, complicated human being who happened to be animated. The later seasons gave you Homer Simpson, the character function, the loud one, the hungry one, the stupid one, the chaos engine. You can build jokes around a character function indefinitely. You cannot build emotional stakes around one, because character functions do not have stakes. They just perform their designated role and reset. The documented phrase that fans and writers both acknowledged, jerkass Homer, points to something deeper than Homer just being meaner. It points to the show losing its grip on why Homer mattered in the first place. He mattered because he was a fundamentally well-meaning person who regularly failed to live up to his own intentions, and the gap between who he was trying to be and who he actually managed to be was where the show's most honest comedy and its most genuine emotion both lived. Remove the good intentions and you remove the gap. Remove the gap and you remove the reason any of it means anything. What you are left with is a loud man doing loud things in a bright animated world, and that is a description of a great many shows that nobody remembers. The fans noticed this change in real time. Online communities and message boards from the late 1990s and early 2000s are full of people trying to put words to the feeling that something had shifted. Not just that the show was less funny. Plenty of shows get less funny over time, but that it felt less true. The Homer of the Golden Age had been true. You could watch him fail and feel something, because the failure revealed something about a real kind of person. The Homer that was emerging felt like a parody of that original version, louder, simpler, stripped of the interior life that had made him worth watching in the first place. Mike Rice acknowledged that the writers heard the complaints, but hearing a complaint and understanding its root cause are different things, and the root cause here was not that specific episodes had made Homer too mean. The root cause was that the writer's room had gradually lost its shared understanding of who Homer fundamentally was. The understanding that had been built by a specific group of people over 6 seasons, and that required those specific people to maintain it. What remained after they left was the surface version, the voice, the shape, the catchphrases, the basic behavioral tendencies. The inner life that had made those things matter had quietly departed, along with the writers who had been responsible for it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Homer's transformation is the most visible symptom of the decline because Homer is the show's central character. But the same process was happening to almost everyone in Springfield at the same time. A slow flattening of complexity, a reduction of full characters into their most obvious and repeatable traits. There is a name for this pattern, and that name came directly from The Simpsons, borrowed from the character whose collapse into a single defining quality became so infamous that it gave the entire phenomenon its permanent label. His name was Ned Flanders, and the story of what happened to him and to every other character in Springfield is where the full scope of the damage becomes clear. Section 4, The Principal and the Pauper, the first crack in the show's canon. The There is a specific kind of trust that builds between a television show and its audience over a long period of time. It is not the same as liking a show. Liking a show means you enjoy watching it. Trust means something more than that. It means you believe the show knows what it is doing, that the characters are real in the way that fictional characters can be real, that the world they live in has rules that the show respects, that the people making it understand what the audience has invested and take that investment seriously. The Simpsons had built that kind of trust over 8 seasons. It had introduced dozens of characters, given them histories and relationships and specific qualities that the audience recognized and returned to week after week. Principal Seymour Skinner had been in the show since the very first season. By the time season 9 arrived, he had appeared in hundreds of episodes. The audience knew him. They knew his relationship with his mother, Agnes, who dominated him completely. They knew his relationship with Edna Krabappel, which had developed slowly and quietly into something real. They knew his background as a Vietnam veteran, which the show had referenced and built on over years. Skinner was not the most prominent character in Springfield, but he was a fully formed one, and the audience's sense of who he was had been constructed carefully and deliberately over nearly a decade of television. On September 28, 1997, the show took everything the audience knew about Seymour Skinner and told them it was a lie. The episode was called The Principal and the Pauper. It was the second episode of season 9, though it had actually been written during season 8 and held back. The basic story is this: Springfield Elementary is throwing a party to celebrate Principal Skinner's 20th anniversary as principal. In the middle of the celebration, a stranger arrives. He is a Vietnam veteran named Seymour Skinner, the real one. He reveals that the man Springfield has known as Principal Skinner for the past 20 years is actually a former street criminal named Armin Tamzarian, who stole his commanding officer's identity after assuming the real Skinner had been killed in the war. Armin Tamzarian, not Seymour Skinner, is the man who has been running their school. The episode then follows what happens when the real Skinner tries to reclaim his life. Agnes Skinner's mother initially connects with the real Skinner, but eventually admits she loves Armin more. The townspeople realize they prefer the imposter to the genuine article. The episode ends with the real Skinner being tied to a train and sent out of Springfield never to return, while the townspeople welcome Armin back and a judge, in a line that reads as deliberate self-awareness on the part of the writers, orders that no one is ever to mention this matter again, under penalty of torture. Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons, publicly called the episode a mistake. Not years later, once the critical consensus had hardened against it, in a 2002 interview with Rolling Stone, he said directly that it was a mistake. He described the ending, where the judge orders everyone to never speak of it again, as the show essentially acknowledging that it knew it had done something wrong and was trying to escape through a meta joke. He also listed the episode as one of his least favorite in the season 9 DVD commentary, a commentary in which he otherwise spoke warmly about the season. Harry Shearer, who has voiced Principal Skinner since the character's first appearance, was given the script before production and pushed back immediately. His response has been quoted in multiple places because it is one of the clearest and most direct things any cast member has ever said about a specific episode. He told the writers, "That is so wrong." He said they were taking something that an audience had built 8 or 9 years of investment in and tossing it in the trash for no good reason, for a story they had already done with other characters. He called it arbitrary and gratuitous and said it was disrespectful to the audience. Years later, in a 2006 interview, he added something that landed even harder. He said the writers refuse to talk about it now. They know it was a horrible mistake. They never mention it. He said it was like they were punishing the audience for paying attention. That phrase, punishing the audience for paying attention, is the most precise description anyone has offered of what the episode did wrong. The people who were hurt most by The Principal and The Pauper were not casual viewers who had caught a handful of episodes. They were the people who had watched every season, who remembered the episodes that had built Skinner's character piece by piece, who had paid close enough attention to feel the weight of what the show was doing when it told them that all of that had been built on a foundation that never existed. Paying attention was exactly what made the episode feel like a betrayal. John Hine, the man who coined the term jumping the shark to describe the moment a television series makes a move so wrong that it never fully recovers, wrote about this episode in his book on the subject. He identified the principal and the pauper as the moment the show jumped. His phrasing was specific. We finally spotted a fin at the start of the 9th season when Principal Skinner's true identity was revealed as Armin Tamzarian. That sentence appeared in a book dedicated entirely to cataloging the exact moments when beloved shows went irreversibly wrong. The episode was not just a bad episode, it was a landmark. Chris Turner, writing in his book Planet Simpson, called it the broadcast that marked the abrupt plunge from the golden age. He was precise about what made it worse than simply being a weak episode. A weak episode is forgotten. This episode could not be forgotten because it had actively changed something about the show's world that could not be unchanged. The audience now knew that the writers were willing to do this, willing to reach back into the show's established history and rewrite it for the sake of a story idea, regardless of what that cost the audience's trust in everything else the show had built. The episode's writer, Ken Keeler, has defended it. He considered it among the best work he had ever done on the show. The co-showrunners at the time, Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, whose tenure ended with season 8 and who had not directly overseen this episode, despite it being a holdover from their production period, also defended the episode's intent, though Oakley acknowledged it was the most controversial episode from his time on the show. Director Stephen Dean Moore defended it. The people closest to making it believed in it. This matters because it points to something more complicated than simple incompetence. The principal and the pauper was not a failure of craft. It was a failure of judgment about the relationship between the show and its audience. The people who made it were skilled enough. They were not attentive enough, or perhaps not attached enough, to what the audience had built up around these characters over the preceding 8 years. What followed the episode's airing was, by the standards of 1997, a significant audience reaction. This was before social media. There was no Twitter, no instant outrage cycle, but online message boards dedicated to The Simpsons filled up with negative responses. Critics wrote about it. The reaction was loud enough and sustained enough that the show eventually took the unusual step of treating the episode as something that had not happened. Later seasons simply ignored the Tamzarian reveal entirely. Season 21's episode, Boy Meets Curl, showed Agnes pregnant with Seymour, directly contradicting the idea that Skinner had assumed another man's identity. Season 26's Walking Big and Tall showed a young Seymour with Agnes in a context that only made sense if he had been her son all along. The show quietly and systematically rebuilt the version of Skinner that the episode had tried to destroy, without ever formally addressing what it had done. Groening confirmed the episode's non-canon status. The show itself confirmed it across multiple subsequent episodes. The judge's order that no one ever speak of the matter again was less a joke and more an accurate description of how the production team eventually chose to handle their own mistake. But the damage was not undone by treating the episode as if it had not happened. The trust that had been broken was not repaired by subsequent seasons simply pretending the break had not occurred. What the episode revealed was not something that could be hidden after the fact. It revealed that the show was now willing to do things that the Golden Age would never have done, and that the reasons it would never have done them were no longer fully present in the room where decisions were being made. The specific thing those reasons depended on was a deep protective relationship with the audience's investment in the show's characters. The Golden Age writers, the ones who had built Skinner across 8 seasons of careful, consistent characterization, understood instinctively that the characters belonged to the audience as much as they belonged to the show. Not legally, not in any formal sense, but in the way that matters to storytelling. The audience's emotional connection to these people was real, and treating it carelessly was not just bad for the audience, but bad for the show, because those connections were the entire basis of its power. Strip them away, and you strip away the reason the jokes land, the reason the emotional moments work, the reason anyone cares what happens to these people at all. The episode aired on a Sunday night and drew a Nielsen rating of 9.2. Still a substantial audience, though below the show's peaks. People watched, they just did not like what they saw. And in the weeks and months that followed, the conversation about whether The Simpsons was still the show it had been became impossible to ignore in a way it had not been before. Seasons 5, 6, 7, and 8 had produced episodes that a small number of fans found disappointing, but nothing that generated the kind of widespread, sustained, creator-acknowledged backlash that this episode produced. The reason the episode mattered so much is not really about Skinner. Skinner is a secondary character. The reason it mattered is what it signaled about the show's relationship to its own history and its own audience going forward. If Skinner could be rewritten this completely after 8 years, nothing was permanent. If the judge's order to never speak of it again could be the resolution to a story that violated nearly a decade of established character, then the show was operating in a world where continuity was optional, where the audience's accumulated knowledge of Springfield could be discarded whenever it became inconvenient for a new story idea, where the investment of paying close attention was not going to be respected. Harry Shearer was right. It was punishing the audience for paying attention, and the audience, by and large, never fully forgot it. The episode did not destroy the show overnight. Seasons 9 and 10 still produced strong individual episodes. Behind the Laughter, Trilogy of Error, Homer at the Bat Callbacks, and others, the decline was not a cliff, it was a slope. But the Principal and the Pauper was the first clear marker planted in the ground, the first moment where even the people who made the show, its creator, its cast, looked at what they had produced and admitted that something had gone wrong. A show that is genuinely at its peak does not produce moments its creator publicly disowns. The Golden Age had never produced one. What the episode also did was establish the template for a specific kind of late-era Simpsons storytelling, the bold, gimmicky plot twist that existed for its own sake that prioritized the surprise of the idea over the integrity of what the show had already built. That template would be used again and again in the seasons that followed, with decreasing connection to the characters and the world the Golden Age had constructed. But this first use of it was by far the most damaging because it was the first time, and because it targeted a character the audience had trusted for 8 years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The loss of that trust was one kind of wound, but running alongside it, and in some ways more damaging over the long term, was something that was happening not just to one character, but to every character in Springfield simultaneously. A slow, season-by-season reduction of complexity that turned fully realized people into walking punchlines. The process even has a name borrowed from one of those characters, and the scale of it, once you start looking for it, is almost hard to believe. Section 5, the Scully era, from heartfelt to anything for a gag, seasons 9 to 12. Mike Scully did not set out to damage The Simpsons. That needs to be the starting point, because the way his name gets used in conversations about the show's decline can make the story sound simpler than it actually is. The easy version of events casts him as the villain, the man who took over a great show and made it worse through bad judgment and poor decisions. That version is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. And getting it right requires understanding what Scully actually inherited when he became showrunner at the start of season 9 in 1997. Scully had been part of the show since season 5. He was not an outsider brought in with no feel for what The Simpsons was. David Merkin hired him in 1993 as a replacement for Conan O'Brien after reading his writing samples. In his first few seasons as a staff writer, Scully wrote episodes that fans and critics still return to. Lisa on Ice from season 6 is an episode about Bart and Lisa being pushed into competition against each other in youth hockey, and it works because it understands something real about sibling rivalry and the way parents can accidentally weaponize their children's relationship against itself. Marge B. Not proud from season 7 came directly from one of the most embarrassing experiences of Scully's own life, being caught shoplifting as a child, and it produced one of the most emotionally honest episodes the show made about the specific pain of disappointing a parent who expected better from you. These are not the episodes of someone who did not understand the show. They are the episodes of someone who understood it well. When Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein stepped down after season 8, Scully was the natural successor. He had earned the position. He had demonstrated that he could write to the show's standard. He was, by every account from writers who worked under him during his tenure, a good and fair manager of the room. Thoughtful about his staff's well-being, careful about working hours, supportive of the people around him. Tom Martin, who wrote for the show during this period, described him as quite possibly the best boss he had ever worked for. None of that was enough to compensate for what he walked into. In the course of his first year as showrunner, Scully lost Oakley and Weinstein, David X. Cohen, Greg Daniels, Dan McGrath, and Brad Bird, the core of the writing talent that had defined seasons 6, 7, and 8. Phil Hartman, who had voiced Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz across dozens of episodes and was one of the most reliable and beloved performers associated with the show, was shot and killed by his wife in May 1998. The loss was devastating on a personal level for everyone who had worked with him, and on a practical level it permanently removed a comic voice that had been woven into the show's fabric across hundreds of appearances. Characters Hartman had given life to simply could not be continued by anyone else, and the show retired them rather than try. The practical result of all of this was that Scully was running a show with a fundamentally different group of people than the one that had produced the previous 4 seasons. The Golden Age had survived one major departure of talent, the loss of Al Jean, Mike Rice, and several others after season 4, because David Merkin and then Oakley and Weinstein were there to absorb the transition and maintain the standard. The standard itself had been so deeply embedded in the room's culture by that point that a new generation of writers could learn it and sustain it. That safety net did not exist for Scully. He was building a new room at the same time as running a show that the entire country was watching every single week, with 22 episodes to produce per season, regardless of whether the new writers had found their footing. John Ortved, who wrote a detailed history of The Simpsons drawing on interviews with many people involved in its production, described Scully as somewhat unfairly becoming the mascot for the show's decline. He acknowledged that Scully had inherited a situation not of his own making. He also wrote that Scully was the man at the helm when the ship turned toward the iceberg, a phrase that has followed Scully's name ever since, because it captures something true. The direction of the ship changed under his watch, regardless of how the conditions for that change had been created. What changed specifically can be traced through the episodes themselves. The Scully era produced a measurable shift in what kind of stories The Simpsons told and what it treated as the engine of those stories. In the Golden Age, episodes had started from a question about a character. What does this person want? What do they fear? What are they avoiding about themselves? And built everything else outward from that. The comedy came from the characters being themselves in specific situations. The emotion came from the same place. The stories felt grounded because they were rooted in people the audience recognized. The Scully era moved Homer to the center of nearly every plot, and the plots themselves moved further and further from anything grounded in recognizable family life. Homer becomes a snowplow driver, a missionary, a food critic, a country singer. He joins a barbershop quartet. He meets Mel Gibson. He travels to Japan, Africa, and beyond. He starts a .com company. The scenarios are not inherently bad ideas for comedy. Some of them produced funny episodes, but collectively they tell the story of a writer's room that had run low on stories rooted in who these characters actually were, and had started reaching outward into increasingly elaborate and disconnected premises to fill the production schedule. One community analysis from the Simpsons fan world put the strategic reasoning behind this approach in plain terms, and it has circulated widely enough to be considered a fair summary of the era. The show was dumbed down and homered up because the writers believed the long-term audience was drifting away, and that competing with South Park and Family Guy meant becoming louder, wilder, and more focused on immediate laughs. Whether that reasoning was consciously applied or was simply the natural result of a new room finding its footing without the Golden Age's guiding instincts, the result was the same. The BBC covering the show during this period documented what it described as the common consensus among viewers and critics. The Golden Era had ended after season 9. That consensus formed during Scully's tenure and is directly attached to it. Scully himself, in a 2007 interview, made a joke about the show's longevity that landed harder than he probably intended. When asked how The Simpsons had managed to keep going for so long, he said the answer was simple: lower your quality standards, and once you do that, you can go on forever. It was a self-deprecating joke. It was also an inadvertent description of the shift that his era had overseen. A shift from a show that held the bar absolutely to one that was willing to accept a lower version of itself in exchange for continued production. The BBC consensus and the fan community analysis are not, however, the complete picture of Scully's 4 seasons. This is where the story becomes more honest than a simple decline narrative allows. Among the episodes produced during seasons 9 through 12 are some that hold up against anything from the Golden Age. HOMR from season 12 is the episode in which Homer has a crayon removed from his brain and becomes significantly smarter. A genuinely moving piece of work about intelligence and belonging and what it costs a person to be different from everyone around them. Hungry Hungry Homer, also from season 12, has Homer discovering through a series of accidents that the Springfield Isotopes baseball team is planning to secretly move to Albuquerque. And his decision to go on a hunger strike to stop it works because it roots his absurdist behavior in something recognizably human: the loyalty a person feels toward the place where they grew up. Trilogy of Error from the same season tells the same chaotic day from 3 overlapping points of view, Homer's, Lisa's, and Bart's, in a way that requires genuine craft to structure and execute. Behind the Laughter from season 11 remains one of the more creative things the show attempted during this entire period. It presents the Simpson family as real people being profiled in a television documentary about their rise and fall as a television dynasty, and it works both as a comedy and as a surprisingly honest piece of self-reflection about what the show had been through. These episodes were produced by the same room in the same era under the same showrunner as the weakest material of the period. They demonstrate that the talent had not entirely disappeared. What had changed was the consistency. The floor of quality that the Golden Age had maintained was gone, and in its place was a much wider gap between the show's best and worst output. That unevenness is itself the signature of the Scully era. A show at its peak does not have that kind of gap. The Golden Age was not perfect, but its weakest episodes were still solidly built, still grounded in character, still recognizably part of the same show that produced its best work. The Scully era's weakest episodes felt like a different show entirely. A louder, stranger, shallower version of The Simpsons that was using the same character names and the same setting without the same understanding of what had made those names and that setting matter. The most painful example of what the era could produce at its worst is season 11's Alone Again Natra Diddley, in which Maud Flanders, Ned's wife, a character present since the earliest seasons, dies as a result of a Homer's carelessness at a racing event. Homer has been goofing around with t-shirt cannons and inadvertently causes Maud to fall from the grandstand. The show then asks the audience to sit with Ned's grief. The premise could have worked. The show had handled death before with real honesty. Bleeding Gums Murphy in season 6, Homer's mother leaving in season 7 both produced genuine emotion because the show had taken the time to make the audience care about what was being lost before asking them to grieve it. Alone Again, Natura. Diddley does not take that time. The circumstances of Maud's death are so arbitrary, a t-shirt cannon, that the grief the episode asks for cannot be felt the way the show needs it to be. The machinery is too visible. The audience can see that a decision was made in a writer's room to kill this character, and the episode does not do enough to make that decision feel inevitable or true. Maggie Roswell, who had voiced Maud since the show's early seasons, had briefly left the show in 1999 over a financial dispute. The decision to kill Maude was made during this period. The exact relationship between those two facts has been discussed in various places, but the practical outcome was the permanent removal of a character who had been part of Springfield for over a decade, handled in a way that felt less like a creative choice and more like a production solution. When Al Jean returned as showrunner in season 13, he was welcomed by critics and fans who had spent 4 seasons watching the show drift. His return was described as a course correction, and in certain respects it was. But the era he inherited from Scully was not the era Scully had inherited from Oakley and Weinstein. The ground that had been given up was not fully recoverable. The characters had been simplified, the emotional stakes had been lowered, the sense of Springfield as a living world with a consistent history that the audience could trust had been weakened in ways that no change of showrunner could entirely reverse. The Scully era set the template for what The Simpsons would become in its long middle and later stretch, a show capable of occasional brilliance but no longer capable of sustained excellence, a show that had traded its grounded emotional core for a wider and louder kind of entertainment. That trade had consequences that would compound across the seasons to come. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And running underneath all of it, underneath the Homer-centered plots, the weakened stories, the declining consistency, was a process affecting not just Homer, but every single character in Springfield at the same time. A slow season-by-season reduction of who these people were, down to what they could be used for. The process had a name. The name came from a specific character whose collapse was so total and so documented that it became the permanent label for the entire phenomenon across all of television. His name was Ned Flanders, and the scale of what happened to him, and to everyone else in Springfield alongside him, is where the full picture of the damage finally comes into view. Section 6. Flanderization across the entire cast. The word Flanderization did not come from a film studies classroom or a television critics journal. It came from fans of The Simpsons, and it came specifically from one character, Ned Flanders, whose transformation across the show's run was so dramatic, so complete, and so widely recognized that it gave its name to an entire pattern of storytelling failure. The term is now used to describe any character in any show who gets slowly reduced from a full, complicated person into a single repeated trait. The fact that the most famous example of this pattern comes from The Simpsons, and that the show produced not 1 or 2 cases of it, but something close to a full cast collapse, tells you a great deal about the scale of what was lost as the seasons continued. Ned Flanders appeared in the show from its very first season. His original function was precise and useful. He was the contrast to Homer. Where Homer was lazy, Ned was hardworking. Where Homer was selfish, Ned was generous. Where Homer was a mediocre father who often put his own desires ahead of his children, Ned was attentive, patient, and present. His family went to church. His house was well maintained. His marriage to Maude was warm and functional. He was, in almost every measurable way, the neighbor Homer could never be, and the show used that contrast to highlight Homer's failings without ever needing to lecture the audience about them. You did not need a character to explain that Homer fell short. You just needed Ned to exist next door. That version of Ned was genuinely interesting because his goodness was not simple. Season 8 gave him a backstory that transformed the character completely. An episode revealed that Ned had been raised by neglectful beatnik parents who refused to discipline him at all, and that the cheerful, controlled, relentlessly positive person he had become was built on top of a mountain of repressed anger that had required years of therapy to manage. That backstory did something important. It explained Ned without reducing him. He was still the good neighbor. He was still generous and kind and present for his family, but now there was a reason for it that made his goodness feel like an achievement rather than a given, something he had worked for and continued to work for, something that could crack under enough pressure. Season 8's Homer Palooza showed Ned briefly losing his composure when pushed far enough. The crack was funny precisely because the composure was real. As the seasons progressed, that complexity gradually disappeared. By the later seasons, Ned Flanders was defined almost entirely by his religion. His life revolved around church. His speech was full of religious references. His reactions to almost every situation were filtered through his faith. The show had taken one aspect of who Ned was, an aspect that had always been present, but had never been his entire personality, and expanded it until it crowded out everything else. The ideal neighbor became a religious caricature. The carefully layered character became a single joke repeated in slightly different forms across hundreds of episodes. The show was aware of this. Episodes in later seasons occasionally tried to return Ned to something closer to his original form, to remind the audience that he had more dimensions than his faith. Those attempts were inconsistent and ultimately unsuccessful, because the writer's room had been operating on the simplified version for so long that the fuller version was harder to access. The character had calcified. Ned's case is the most famous because his name became the label. But he was not the most severe example of the pattern in the show's cast. That distinction arguably belongs to Principal Skinner, whose transformation preceded and in some ways precipitated the larger conversation about what the show was doing to its characters. Before the Principal and the Pauper in Season 9, Skinner had been a layered figure, a Vietnam veteran, Agnes's dominated son, Edna Krabappel's cautious romantic interest, a man whose rigid authority at Springfield Elementary was clearly a response to a life in which other people had always held power over him. The show had built that character carefully across 8 seasons of appearances in dozens of episodes. After the Principal and the Pauper, and across the seasons that followed, Skinner became progressively smaller. The interesting edges of the character, the Vietnam history, the complicated relationship with authority, the genuine, if repressed, romantic feeling for Edna, were visited less and less. What remained was the most easily repeatable version of Skinner, the stiff, rule-following principal who was dominated by his mother and occasionally embarrassed. The character did not disappear, he just became thinner. The audience could still recognize him, they just could not be surprised by him anymore. Barney Gumble is another case that is easy to document. In the show's earliest seasons, Barney was Homer's closest friend at Moe's Tavern, a man with a history, with some evident intelligence underneath the drinking, with a presence in Homer's life that felt genuinely warm. Season 4's Homer's Barbershop Quartet showed a younger Barney who was an extraordinary singer, whose talent was real and remarkable, whose life could have gone somewhere very different from where it went. That episode is funny, but it is also quietly sad in the way the best Golden Age episodes were. It shows you a version of a person who existed before the version you know, and the distance between those two versions carries weight. Season 6 gave Barney a heartbreaking sequence where he makes a genuinely beautiful short film, wins a film festival, and then, when offered champagne as a prize, falls immediately off the wagon. The joke and the sadness exist simultaneously, neither cancels the other. In later seasons, Barney's alcoholism became his entire character. He was no longer a person who drank too much. He was a drinking joke that occasionally had lines. The history, the intelligence, the friendship with Homer, the buried talent, all of it faded into the background and then disappeared almost entirely. The show kept using him, but the version it was using was a fraction of what had been there. Lisa Simpson's transformation is in some ways the most instructive because it happened in the opposite direction from Homer's. Where Homer became meaner and louder and more selfish, Lisa became more principled and more vocal and more consistently right about everything. In the Golden Age, Lisa was a child, genuinely, specifically a child, with a child's emotional volatility and a child's inconsistencies. She was brilliant, but she was also petty sometimes. She was compassionate, but she also wanted attention and recognition in the way any 8-year-old does. Season 6's Lisa on Ice has Lisa initially enjoying the fact that she is better than Bart at hockey, enjoying his failure in a way that is not generous or noble at all. She is a kid being competitive and a little cruel, and the show presents this honestly without turning her into a villain. The later seasons progressively stripped out those contradictions. Lisa became the show's moral voice, the character who was correct about social issues, environmental issues, political issues, the character whose job was to deliver the episode's lesson, or to represent a point of view the show wanted to endorse. The emotional and social complexity of the Golden Age Lisa contracted. Her function expanded. She became less of a character and more of a position. Fans and critics developed a specific name for this version of Lisa, Soapbox Sadie, which described her tendency in later seasons to turn almost any situation into an opportunity to advocate for a cause. The name stuck because it captured something real. The later Lisa was less a person navigating the world than a vehicle for opinions, and the opinions, however reasonable in isolation, had replaced the interior life that made the Golden Age version of the character someone the audience genuinely cared about. Bart's transformation is quieter but equally real. The Bart of the first 2 seasons was a genuine cultural phenomenon, a character so vivid and so surprising that his face was on every product imaginable, and George H.W. Bush was publicly attacking him by name. What made Bart work in those early seasons was his unpredictability. He was mischievous in ways that felt genuinely dangerous because the show had not yet fully established its own limits. He could be mean. He could be genuinely reckless. He could surprise you. Season 5 produced Cape Fear, in which Sideshow Bob is released from prison and stalks Bart with the explicit intention of killing him. The episode works partly because Bart's fear is real, and the threat is real, and the show does not fully undercut either. As the seasons progressed and the cultural moment of Bart as a phenomenon faded, the show seemed uncertain what to do with him. He became tamer. The genuine danger of the Golden Age Bart, the sense that he might actually do something you could not predict, was replaced by a more reliable and less interesting version of mischief. His relationships with Homer, with Lisa, with his friends became less dynamic. Episodes that focused on Bart became less consistent in quality. The character that had once been the show's breakout figure gradually became one of its less interesting elements. The process that happened to all of these characters has the same underlying structure. The Golden Age had built each of them with multiple dimensions, with strengths and weaknesses that coexisted, with histories that explained them without reducing them, with the capacity to surprise the audience by acting in ways that were consistent with who they were but not entirely predictable from how they were usually deployed. The later seasons progressively simplified each character down to their most repeatable and most useful trait. Ned became the religion joke, Barney became the drinking joke, Lisa became the smart liberal kid, Bart became the troublemaker, Skinner became the uptight principal, Moe became the sad bartender. Each of them lost the dimensions that had made them feel like people rather than functions. This process was not deliberate. No one in the writer's room sat down and decided to make Ned less complicated or Barney less human. What happened was more passive than that, and a slow drift driven by the practical demands of producing 22 episodes per season with a rotating group of writers who had varying degrees of familiarity with the show's history. When you are writing a new episode every week and you need Ned Flanders to appear in 2 scenes, the easiest version of Ned to write is the religious one. The easiest version of Barney is the drunk one. The easiest version of Lisa is the one who is right about something. These versions are easy because they are the most surface level, the most immediately recognizable, the most reliable in terms of generating a specific kind of response from the audience. They work in the short term. They just cost something in the long term. They cost the complexity that made these characters worth spending time with in the first place. The Golden Age had prevented this drift through the sheer force of a writer's room that held a very high standard for every character in every scene. The people in that room knew these characters deeply, not just the traits, but the histories, the relationships, the specific ways each person would respond to a specific situation, and they were protective of that knowledge. A joke that reduced Ned to a simple religious caricature would not have survived the table read in season 7. because there were people in the room who understood that Ned was more than that and who would have pushed back. That protection was gone by the time the Scully era was underway and gone entirely by the middle of the Al Jean era. The characters continued, the protection did not. What the full cast Flanderization produced over enough seasons was a Springfield that felt increasingly hollow. The town was still populated, the familiar faces were still there, but the sense that these were real people with interior lives, with histories that mattered, with the capacity to surprise you, that sense had quietly departed. What remained was a reliable cast of recognizable types performing their designated functions week after week, and the audience could feel the difference even if they could not always name it. Underscore, quote underscore 5 underscore the celebrity cameo problem, which would become one of the most visible symptoms of the show's later decline, grew directly from this hollowing out. When the characters are fully alive, celebrity guests serve the story. They arrive in the world of Springfield and interact with people who feel real. When the characters are reduced to functions, celebrity guests become the most interesting thing in the room by default. The show's increasing reliance on big names to generate interest was not a separate problem from the Flanderization of its cast, it was a direct consequence of it. And the story of how those celebrity appearances changed, from Dustin Hoffman playing a character who transformed Lisa's understanding of herself, to Lady Gaga playing herself in an episode that the show's own writers have since apologized for, is one of the clearest measurements of how far the show had traveled from what it once was. Section 7, the celebrity cameo collapse, from characters to commercials. In the second season of The Simpsons, a substitute teacher arrived at Springfield Elementary. His name was Mr. Bergstrom. He was warm, attentive, and genuinely interested in his students in a way that the regular teachers at the school never were. He saw Lisa Simpson, really saw her, in the way she had always wanted to be seen, and treated her intelligence and sensitivity as real things worth taking seriously. When he had to leave Springfield, he gave her a note to open later. She opened it on the bus home. It said, "You are Lisa Simpson." The man playing Mr. Bergstrom was Dustin Hoffman. His name did not appear in the credits. He asked to be listed as Sam Ettick, a fake name, because in 1991 the gap between the film actors and television was still wide enough that a major Hollywood star was uncertain about being publicly associated with a cartoon. He agreed to do the role not because The Simpsons was the hottest show on television, which it was, but because the material was genuinely worth doing. The episode asked something real of him. It gave his character a real arc, a real relationship with another character, a real moment of genuine feeling at its center. The celebrity served the story. The story did not exist to serve the celebrity. That distinction, the celebrity serving the story versus the story serving the celebrity, is the entire history of what happened to guest appearances on The Simpsons across its run. And the distance between those two poles, measured in the specific episodes the show produced at either end of its history, is one of the most precise measurements available of how far the show fell from what it once was. The early seasons understood something about celebrity appearances that the later seasons forgot entirely. The best guest performances from the Golden Age share a specific quality. The celebrity is either playing a character created specifically for the episode, or playing a version of themselves that the show is willing to make uncomfortable. Neither of those approaches treats the celebrity as a prize to be displayed. Both of them treat the celebrity as a tool to be used in service of a story. Season 3 produced Stark Raving Dad, in which Homer is sent to a psychiatric facility and meets a large white man who claims to be Michael Jackson. The man, voiced by Jackson under the name John J. Smith because Jackson asked not to be officially credited, is not presented as Michael Jackson in the way the audience expects. The episode does not trade on Jackson's fame as something inherently valuable. It uses the premise of a man who believes he is Michael Jackson to tell a story about Bart and Lisa's relationship, about what it means to make someone feel special, about the gap between who a famous person is and who their fans need them to be. The real Jackson is present in the performance. The episode spends considerable time puncturing the kind of celebrity worship that makes Jackson's presence feel important in the first place. That is a sophisticated thing to do with a famous person. It requires the show to be willing to use the celebrity against their own image, rather than simply borrowing the glow of that image for 22 minutes. Season 2 also gave the show Danny DeVito as Herb Powell, Homer's long-lost half-brother, in an episode that used DeVito's specific energy, the compressed intensity, the fast-talking ambition, the warmth underneath the abrasiveness, to tell a story about class and family and what it costs a person to find out that the relative they have been imagining as better than them is Homer Simpson. Herb Powell returned in Season 3 for a follow-up episode. He was a real character. DeVito played him as a real character. The episode was not about having Danny DeVito on The Simpsons. It was about Herb Powell, who happened to be voiced by Danny DeVito. Albert Brooks appeared in Season 5 as Hank Scorpio, the supervillain who employs Homer and is unfailingly supportive and kind while also planning to take over the world. The episode is considered by many fans to be among the very best the show ever produced. Brooks improvised large portions of his performance, and the specificity of what he brought to Scorpio, the genuine warmth, the cheerful competence, the complete absence of the self-aware villainy the genre usually requires, made the character something the show could never have created without him. But again, the episode is not about having Albert Brooks on The Simpsons. It is about Homer finding a job he loves and a boss who believes in him, and the comedy of that situation happening in the context of a global takeover plot. None of these appearances are built around the celebrity's fame as the primary selling point. All of them use the celebrity's specific abilities to serve something the story needed. Data researcher Nathan Kunn tracked celebrity appearances across the show's entire run and found a clean and measurable pattern. During the Golden Age, seasons 3 through roughly season 10, the show averaged 0.65 celebrity appearances per episode. After the Golden Age ended, that number rose to 1.13 celebrity appearances per episode, nearly double. The frequency alone tells part of the story. The nature of the appearances tells the rest. The first season to cross the threshold of more than one celebrity per episode on average was season 10. The same season that most analysis identifies as the period when the Golden Age was definitively over. The episode that Kunn specifically identifies as the first clear post-Golden Age episode is Season 10's Sunday Cruddy Sunday, which featured no fewer than 8 celebrity appearances, 7 of them playing themselves. 7 celebrities appearing as themselves in a single episode. In the Golden Age, a celebrity playing themselves was the exception, and almost always involved some level of self-mockery or self-awareness. 7 of them in one episode, there purely to be recognizable, is a different thing entirely. The structural difference between Golden Age and late-era celebrity appearances is not subtle once you know to look for it. In the Golden Age, the question the writers asked was, what does this story need, and is there a person who can provide it? In the later seasons, the question reversed. We have this celebrity available, what story can we build around them? The first question produces episodes where the celebrity's presence feels inevitable and earned. The second produces episodes where the celebrity's presence feels like the point, where the episode exists not to tell a story, but to deliver a famous person to the audience and ask them to be pleased by the delivery. Season 23 produced Lisa Goes Gaga, in which Lady Gaga arrives in Springfield specifically to help Lisa, who is the most depressed person in town. Gaga plays herself. The episode is built around her. The supporting characters exist primarily to react to her presence. By the end, Lisa has been lifted out of her depression through the power of Gaga's positivity and her connection to her fans. The episode received an IMDb rating of 4.3 out of 10. The lowest rating of any episode in the show's entire history by a significant distance. The comparison to Lisa's substitute is not made often enough, or made clearly enough, because it is so complete that it almost makes further analysis unnecessary. Both episodes are about Lisa being seen and understood by someone from outside her regular life. Both episodes end with Lisa feeling better about who she is. Both episodes use a famous person as the vehicle for that transformation. The differences are in every other detail. In Lisa's substitute, Dustin Hoffman played a character who was not Dustin Hoffman. He asked not to be credited under his real name. The episode was not about having Dustin Hoffman on the show. It was about a specific child's relationship with a specific teacher, and the celebrity's talent was used to make that relationship feel real. The celebrity served the story. In Lisa Goes Gaga, Lady Gaga played Lady Gaga. The episode existed because Lady Gaga was available and the show wanted her on it. The story was constructed afterward to justify her presence. Lisa's depression and recovery were not the point. Lady Gaga being on The Simpsons was the point. The story served the celebrity. The writers of the show have acknowledged this. Multiple people associated with the production have described the Lady Gaga episode as a mistake, and the IMDb score of 4.3 represents one of the most clear and unanimous negative audience verdicts in the show's history. The episode was not hated because Lady Gaga is a bad performer. She is an exceptionally talented one. It was hated because the episode did not use her talent in service of anything real. It used her fame in service of an episode that the show should not have made. Season 26 produced The Musk Who Fell to Earth, in which Elon Musk arrives in Springfield and becomes Homer's friend and business partner. Musk plays himself. The episode presents him as a visionary genius whose ideas are too advanced for the ordinary world of Springfield to appreciate. It is, in the assessment of most critics and fans who have written about it, 22 minutes of the show admiring a famous person rather than doing anything interesting with him. Its IMDb rating ranks it as the second lowest rated episode in the show's history, just above the Lady Gaga episode. 2 of the bottom 3 episodes of a show that produced over 700 episodes involve celebrities playing idealized versions of themselves in stories built entirely around delivering them to the audience. The contrast with how the show handled Tony Blair, who appeared in season 15's The Regina Monologues when the Simpsons visit England, is instructive. Blair appeared at the airport to greet the family. Homer, failing to recognize him, said he could not believe they had met Mr. Bean. The joke works because it is at Blair's expense. The show was not in the business of flattering its guest. It was in the business of comedy, and comedy sometimes requires making the famous person the butt of the joke rather than the object of admiration. The Simpsons movie, released in 2007, provides one of the clearest examples of the show's own production team understanding the problem from the inside. Edward Norton had agreed to appear in the film. During post-production, the filmmakers made the decision to cut his cameo entirely because it was distracting from the story. A major Hollywood actor already recorded removed from the final cut because his presence was drawing attention to itself in a way that hurt the film rather than helped it. The Golden Age had made that same calculation instinctively episode after episode. The later seasons had largely stopped making it. The reason celebrity cameos shifted from story tools to story substitutes is directly connected to what had happened to the show's regular cast. When the characters in Springfield are fully alive, when Homer is complicated, when Lisa has genuine interior life, when Ned has depth beneath his surface, celebrity guests arrive in a world that can absorb them and use them. The show's existing characters are interesting enough that a famous visitor has to earn their place in the story by contributing something the regulars cannot provide. When the characters have been flattened to their most basic functions, the oaf, the smart kid, the religious neighbor, celebrity guests become the most interesting presence in the room by default. The story gravitates toward them not because the writers have consciously decided this, but because the existing characters no longer have enough complexity to generate stories on their own. The celebrity becomes a crutch precisely because the show has allowed the thing the crutch was supposed to support to weaken. Phil Hartman's death in 1998 removed Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz from the show permanently, and both characters were retired rather than recast. This was the right decision made in terrible circumstances, and it meant that two of the show's most reliably funny recurring figures were gone. But it also accelerated the pressure to find other ways to fill the comedy gap those characters had occupied, and the easiest replacement in a show that had the cultural profile to attract almost anyone was more celebrity appearances, more famous people, more names that the audience would recognize. The crutch got heavier as the show got weaker, and the show got weaker partly because it was leaning on the crutch. By the time the show was deep into the Al Jean era, celebrity appearances had become so routine that individual ones barely registered. Dozens of famous people passing through Springfield every season, most of them playing themselves, most of them serving no story purpose beyond their own presence. The machine kept producing them because the machine needed to produce something, and celebrity cameos were reliably easy to arrange and reliably capable of generating at least a brief burst of interest from audiences who had largely stopped expecting the episodes themselves to provide it. The audience that had watched Dustin Hoffman play a substitute teacher who changed Lisa's life in 1991 was watching Lady Gaga be Lady Gaga in Springfield in 2012. The distance between those two moments is not just a matter of individual episode quality. It is a measure of an entire philosophy of what television is for, whether it exists to tell stories about people, or whether it exists to deliver famous faces to an audience that has been trained to accept the delivery as a substitute for the story. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The celebrity cameo collapse is one of the most visible symptoms of the show's decline because it is so easy to point to and compare. But there is a version of the story that is harder to see and in some ways more damaging. The slow erasure, not of any single episode's quality, but of the show's connection to the world it was supposedly reflecting. The Simpsons had been at its best a show about America, about what it actually felt like to live in this country, to be part of a family that fell short of what families were supposed to be, to work a job you did not choose for a boss who did not value you, to love people imperfectly and be loved imperfectly in return. That connection between Springfield and the real world outside it was the foundation of everything the show's satire had been built on. And the story of how that connection was lost season by season is where the decline becomes not just a story about a television show, but a story about what a television show can mean to the people who grew up watching it. Section 8, the Al Jean tenure, longevity as its own problem, seasons 13 to 33 plus. When Al Jean returned as showrunner at the start of season 13 in 2001, the reaction from people who cared about The Simpsons was cautiously optimistic. John had been there at the beginning. He had co-run seasons 3 and 4 alongside Mike Rice, and those two seasons are still considered by many critics and fans to be the finest the show ever produced. Bill Oakley, who ran the show after Gene left the first time, said that John and Rice were responsible for the best thing that ever appeared on television, the third season of The Simpsons. John understood the show at a level almost nobody else still active in its production could claim. If anyone could arrest the drift that the Scully era had produced, the thinking went, it was the man who had helped build what the show was trying to return to. MSNBC's John Bonet wrote about Jenkins' return in terms that captured the general mood. He said Gene had guided the show away from its gag-heavy, Homer-centered version, and that these were brighter days for the show's long-term fans. The early seasons of John's second tenure did produce some improvement in consistency. The most egregious tendencies of the Scully era, Homer being dropped into increasingly disconnected scenarios with no connection to family life, plots that existed purely for spectacle, were dialed back somewhat. The room was steadier. The floor came up a little, and then Al Jean stayed and stayed and stayed. John did not leave after 2 or 3 seasons the way showrunners before him had. He did not hand the show to the next generation after finding his footing. He remained as showrunner from season 13 all the way through season 33, over 2 full decades in the same chair, overseeing the same show, with the same core group of writers, producing the same 22 episodes per season year after year. year. His tenure as showrunner is the longest in the show's history by an enormous distance. No other person has held that role for more than 4 seasons. John held it for more than 20. That longevity is not on its face a negative thing. Stability has value. Consistency has value. A showrunner who deeply understands a show and is committed to it over a long period can provide a kind of continuity that a rotating succession of showrunners cannot. But the value of stability depends entirely on what is being stabilized. If the show is at its peak and the creative engine is running well, stability preserves excellence. If the show has already begun to drift and the creative engine needs new fuel, stability can lock in the drift and make it permanent. The Simpsons under Gene's long second tenure was not at its peak. It was a show that had already lost its best writers, already simplified its characters, already shifted its relationship with its audience in ways that had not been repaired. Stabilizing that version of The Simpsons did not recover what had been lost. It institutionalized the loss. John himself acknowledged the central challenge of his position in terms that were honest and precise. He said in an interview that has been quoted many times in discussions of the show's later years that the difficulty was finding an idea that was good but had not already been seen. The show had been running long enough that the people watching it and the people writing it were, in his words, so on top of things that had been done before that the challenge of genuine originality became almost impossibly difficult to meet every week. With over 500 episodes produced by the time John was deep into his tenure, and eventually over 700, the combinatorial problem of what had not yet been done with these characters in this town was not a creative challenge, it was a mathematical wall. The response to that wall was not to tear it down, it was to build around it. The show continued producing 22 episodes per season regardless of whether genuine new stories were available. The result across John's long tenure was a kind of production line quality that kept the show technically functional while draining it of the urgency that had made the golden age feel necessary. Episodes arrived and departed without leaving much trace. Seasons accumulated without distinguishing themselves from the seasons before or after. The show became, in the most literal possible sense, background television, something that was there, that people had on, that produced occasional moments of genuine quality surrounded by a great deal of filler that met the minimum requirement of being an episode of The Simpsons without asking anything more of itself. The writer's room that Jean oversaw during this long stretch became, by the mid-2000s, one of the most static in television. Most of the show's regular writing staff during the Gene era had joined the show between 1998 and 2002 and simply never left. Matt Selman joined in 1997 and eventually became co-showrunner. John Frink joined in 1997. J. Stewart Burns joined in 2000. Michael Price joined in 1999. These writers were talented people who knew the show deeply. They were also people who had been in the same room working on the same show for over a decade without significant external creative pressure forcing them to evolve or raise their game. In the Golden Age, the writer's room had been characterized by high turnover. People came in, worked intensely for a few seasons, and then left for their own projects, then to create their own shows, to pursue other opportunities, to move on. That turnover was painful in the short term because it meant constant rebuilding, but it also meant constant renewal. New voices arrived regularly with fresh perspectives, new sensibilities, new ideas about what the show could do. The pressure of building and rebuilding the room kept the standard from calcifying. By the middle of John's tenure, that renewal had essentially stopped. The two newest full-time writing additions in the 2000s had both joined in 2015, years after the show had already been in steep decline by most measurable standards. The room was not being refreshed, it was being maintained. The same people, producing the same show in the same building year after year. The institutional knowledge was deep. The institutional comfort was deeper, and institutional comfort is the enemy of the kind of creative pressure that produced seasons 3 through 8. Gene was asked directly about the quality criticism his tenure attracted, and his response has been widely quoted because it captures his perspective on the entire conversation. He said it was possible the show had declined, but that he had been there the whole time, and he remembered people saying it had gone downhill back in season 2. He said if they had listened to that criticism and stopped after episode 13, he was glad they had not. The argument was that quality complaints about The Simpsons were permanent and had existed since the beginning, and that the show's continued existence was therefore its own answer to those complaints. The problem with that argument is that it treats all quality complaints as equivalent when they are not. The complaints about Season 2 were not about a measurable decline. Season 2 of The Simpsons is, by any reasonable measure, better than almost anything else that was on television at the time. The complaints about Season 25 or Season 30 were about a show that was averaging 4 million and then fewer than 2 million viewers, whose episodes were rating between 5.5 and 6.5 on IMDb, whose characters had been simplified into functions, whose stories had lost connection to anything recognizable as real family life. Those are not the same kind of complaint. Treating them as equivalent is a way of avoiding a reckoning that the show's own numbers made unavoidable. The numbers are worth sitting with for a moment because they are not ambiguous. During the John era's later stretch, Season 25 averaged 4 million viewers. Season 34 averaged 1.83 million. Season 35 opened with a premiere that drew 3.58 million, a number inflated by the occasion of a season opener, and then the 3 episodes following it averaged barely more than 1 million viewers each. The gap between a season premiere and the episodes immediately after it was by itself a story. The audience was willing to check in for a special occasion and then leave again immediately, because what they found when they checked in was not compelling enough to make them stay. Gian had an answer for the viewership decline as well, and it was not entirely wrong. The entire television landscape had changed. Streaming services had fragmented the audience. No show on any network could hold the kind of viewership The Simpsons had commanded in the early 1990s. Because the early 1990s viewing environment, a small number of channels competing for an audience with limited alternatives, no longer existed. This is true. The highest rated shows on American television in the mid-2000s averaged about half the Nielsen rating of the top shows from 1989. The overall decline in traditional television viewership accounts for some of the drop, but it does not account for all of it. Data analyst Todd Schneider, working with viewership figures across the show's entire run, found that the overall decline in television viewership explained roughly half of the drop. The other half was specific to The Simpsons, audiences choosing not to watch this show in particular, rather than simply choosing not to watch television in general. Schneider also noted that Simpsons World, the streaming platform that made every episode available on demand, showed modern viewers consistently choosing the early seasons over the later ones. When people actively sought out The Simpsons, they watched the Golden Age. The later seasons were available to them, and they did not watch them. That is not a measurement of television fragmentation. It is a measurement of preference. Jane's tenure also coincided with the show's increasing move toward what critics called topical relevance. Episodes that referenced current events, current celebrities, current cultural moments in ways designed to signal that the show was still paying attention to the world. The problem with this approach is structural. The Simpsons takes months to produce an episode. South Park takes 6 days. A show that takes months to respond to a cultural moment will always be behind it by the time the episode airs, and the episode's topical reference will feel dated to an audience that has already moved on. The Golden Age had not relied on topical relevance. Its satire was aimed at permanent things and the relationship between work and dignity, the gap between the American family ideal and the American family reality, the way institutions fail the people they are supposed to serve. Those targets do not go out of date. The later season's reliance on specific cultural references produced episodes that felt current for about a week and then began to age in a way the Golden Age never had. The other thing John's long tenure produced was a specific kind of narrative drift around Lisa. Under Julian's watch, Lisa's character moved progressively further from the complicated child of the Golden Age and further toward the show's primary vehicle for political and social commentary. This was not unique to Gene. The drift had begun before his return, but his 2 decades in the chair allowed it to become fully settled. By the later Gene years, Lisa episodes were reliably about a cause or a position rather than about a person. The emotional stakes of her storylines contracted as her ideological function expanded. The character who had once been one of the most specific and recognizable children in the history of animated television had become a reliable delivery mechanism for the show's opinions about the world. There is a version of this story where Al Jean is a villain, and that version is as unfair as the version where Mike Scully is a villain. Gene kept a very long-running show alive and occasionally produced genuinely excellent work during his tenure. He understood the show's history. He cared about it. He was not indifferent to the quality complaints and made genuine efforts to address them at various points across his run. The problem was not his commitment. It was the situation. A show that had already lost its essential quality, being run by a person who had been inside it too long to see clearly what it had lost, staffed by writers who had been in the same room for too long to generate the creative pressure that excellence requires, producing episodes for a commercial structure that demanded 22 per season, regardless of whether there were 22 stories genuinely worth telling. Gian eventually stepped down as showrunner, with Matt Selman taking the role for the show's current era. The transition was announced quietly, without the kind of cultural event that might have accompanied such a change in the show's earlier years. The show continued. It is still continuing. And the numbers that defined Gene's final years, fewer than 2 million viewers per week, IMDb scores that would have been unthinkable during the Golden Age, continued with it. The Al Jean era is not where the decline began. It is where the decline became permanent, where the decisions and changes and losses of the Scully era were stabilized into an institutional version of a lesser show and held there for 20 years. The ship that Scully had turned toward the iceberg did not sink under John. It just kept sailing in the same direction, slowly, steadily, for so long that the iceberg became the horizon. Quote _7 _ what the numbers tell, the viewership, the IMDb scores, the preference data from streaming, is a story about an audience that tried to tell the show what had been lost and was not meaningfully heard. But numbers only tell part of the story. The other part lives in what the show was actually doing week after week in its later years, what it was putting on screen, and what that revealed about how far the connection between Springfield and the real world had been allowed to erode. Because at its peak, The Simpsons had not just been a funny show about a cartoon family. It had been a precise and sometimes devastating map of what American life actually felt like. And the story of how that map stopped being accurate and then stopped being attempted is where the decline becomes something more than a television story. Section 9. The viewership collapse. The numbers over 35 years numbers do not lie in the way that opinions can. You can disagree about whether a specific episode of The Simpsons was good or bad, whether a particular character change was damaging or just different, whether the show lost something essential or simply evolved in ways that not everyone liked. Those arguments have been going on for decades and will continue going on because they are arguments about taste and memory and the complicated relationship between a generation and the show it grew up watching. But the viewership numbers are not an argument. They are a record. And the record of what happened to the Simpsons audience across 35 years of television is one of the most dramatic declines in the history of American broadcasting. Start at the beginning. The Simpsons premiered in December 1989 with a Christmas special called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire. It drew 27.8 million viewers. That number for a brand new show that had never aired before was extraordinary. The first full season averaged 13.4 million households watching every week. The second season opened with Bart Gets and F, the episode about Bart failing a history test, and drew 33.6 million viewers for a single episode. 33 million people watched a cartoon about a kid failing a test on a Sunday night in 1990. That number remains the highest single episode audience in the show's entire history, across every one of its more than 700 episodes. The early seasons of the show averaged over 20 million viewers per episode. That figure requires some context to fully appreciate. In the early 1990s, there were far fewer television channels than there are today. There was no streaming. There was no YouTube. If you wanted to watch something in the evening, you chose from a small number of networks, and a show that pulled 20 million viewers was not just successful. It was a shared national experience that most of the country was participating in simultaneously. Through the Golden Age, the numbers stayed high. Season 10 still averaged around 14 million viewers. The show was still one of the most watched programs on American television. The audience had not yet begun its long walk toward the exit. The slide, when it came, was steady, and it did not stop. Season 12 averaged approximately 15 million viewers. Season 17 averaged around 9 million. Season 25, which aired in 2013 and 2014, averaged 4 million. Season 27 averaged 4 million according to Nielsen, less than half what Season 17 had drawn just a decade earlier. Season 34 averaged 1.83 million. Season 35 dropped further, averaging approximately 1.74 million for the season overall. Season 36 produced numbers that completed the picture. The average viewership for the season landed around 1.2 million, from a peak of over 33 million for a single episode to 1.2 million, as a season average, which represents a decline of over 96% from the show's highest point. Even measured against the more stable seasons of the mid-1990s, averaging 20 million per episode, the later seasons represent a decline of over 90%. The IMDb ratings tell a parallel story in a different form. IMDb allows viewers to rate individual episodes, and a Reddit user compiled the ratings for every episode across the show's entire run into a visual chart that circulated widely because it made the decline impossible to dismiss or argue away. Episodes from seasons 1 through 9 clustered between 7.5 and 9.0. Season 10 began a shift, with ratings dropping into the 6.0 to 7.5 range. By season 25, individual episodes were regularly rating between 5.5 and 6.5. The chart produced 3 distinct bands: a golden age of consistent excellence in the first 9 seasons, a middle period of declining but still watchable television through roughly seasons 10 to 20, and a later period of genuinely weak material that the audience rated accordingly. The people who managed and studied the show's ratings acknowledged what the numbers showed while offering explanations designed to put them in context. The most common explanation was the fragmentation of the television audience, the rise of streaming services, the explosion in the number of available channels and shows, the shift in how people consumed entertainment. This explanation has genuine validity. Data analyst Todd Schneider examined the broader television landscape and found that the top 30 shows on American television in the mid-2000s averaged a rating about 50% lower than the top 30 shows from 1989. The entire television landscape had shrunk in terms of individual show viewership as the audience spread across more options, but Schneider's own analysis pointed to a problem with using this explanation as the primary reason for The Simpsons' decline. The show's viewership had dropped approximately 80 to 85% from its peak, far exceeding the 50% industry-wide decline. The gap between the industry-wide drop and the Simpsons-specific drop was 30 to 35 percentage points. That gap represents viewers who were choosing not to watch The Simpsons specifically, rather than simply choosing to watch less television in general. The fragmented landscape explains some of the numbers. It does not explain all of them. The streaming data that emerged as platforms made the show's entire library available provided perhaps the clearest evidence of where the real problem lay. Simpsons World gave viewers access to every episode on demand, meaning the audience could choose to watch any season, any episode at any time. When people chose freely without any scheduling pressure, without any obligation to watch what was currently airing, they overwhelmingly chose the early seasons. The Golden Age episodes were the ones being actively sought out and watched. The later seasons were available and being ignored. This is the most direct possible measurement of the audience's actual preference. It removes every complicating factor on fragmented attention, competing shows, changing television habits, and produces a single clean data point. When viewers choose for themselves, they choose seasons 3 through 8. They do not choose season 25 or season 30 when given the option of season 5. The season premiere problem became increasingly visible in the show's later years, and it told its own story. Season 35 opened with a premiere that drew 3.58 million viewers, more than double the season's eventual average. The 3 episodes immediately following the premiere drew barely more than 1 million viewers each. The pattern was consistent across multiple seasons. The premiere drew a larger audience, and then most of those viewers left after the first episode and did not come back. What that pattern describes is an audience that was curious enough to check in when a new season started, drawn perhaps by habit, by nostalgia, by the cultural weight of a show they had grown up with, and then found once they watched that what was there was not enough to keep them. The premiere was an occasion, the show itself was not. The audience came back to see if anything had changed and discovered that nothing had, and then they left again. That cycle repeated itself season after season. The advertising market registered the decline in the way advertising markets register everything through money. The cost of a 30-second advertisement during The Simpsons had declined significantly from its peak years, tracking the viewership drop. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, advertising during The Simpsons was among the most valuable time on American television. By the mid-2000s, the price had fallen substantially, and the show had largely lost the commercial status it had held during the Golden Age. The 2018 to 2019 season actually showed a slight increase in advertising rates, the first in roughly 4 years, but the broader trend was unmistakably downward. Fox had kept the show on the air through all of this, and the reasons for that decision were not primarily creative. The Simpsons was an institution. Its merchandise, its licensing deals, its theme park presence, its cultural brand, all of these things had value that extended well beyond what any individual season's ratings could capture. A show can be commercially valuable as a property even when it is no longer compelling as television, and The Simpsons had long since passed into the category of properties whose institutional value exceeded their week-to-week entertainment value. The show's transition toward Disney Plus, which began with a season 36 Christmas special released exclusively on the streaming platform, was the clearest signal yet that the era of The Simpsons as a weekly broadcast event was drawing toward an end. The property was migrating to a platform where legacy value and library access mattered more than current viewership, where the Golden Age episodes and the cultural weight of the brand could sustain interest regardless of what the new episodes were doing. It was, in its own quiet way, an acknowledgement that the show's future value lay in its past rather than its present. The numbers across 35 years form a complete story on their own. A show that once drew a third of the country to their televisions every week now draws fewer viewers than a modestly successful YouTube channel. The decline is not ambiguous, not a matter of interpretation, not something that can be explained away by context. What can be argued about is what the numbers mean, whether they represent a failure of the show itself or simply the natural consequence of time and a changed world. That argument will continue. Underscore, quote, underscore, 8, underscore, but underneath the numbers deeper than the ratings and the IMDb scores and the advertising revenue, there is a different kind of loss that the data can point toward but cannot fully measure. The Simpsons at its peak was not just watched by tens of millions of people, it meant something to those people, something about what their lives were, what their country country was, what it felt like to be part of a family that did not live up to the ideal. That connection between the show and the reality of the people watching it was the foundation everything else was built on. The numbers show when the audience started leaving. What the numbers cannot show is exactly when the show stopped being worth staying for, when it stopped being about something true and started being about itself. That story is less about data and more about what the show was actually putting on screen in its later years, and how the world that Springfield had once reflected so clearly became, season by season, harder and harder to find inside it. Section 10, the loss of emotional stakes, what the show stopped doing. There is a scene near the end of a season 7 episode called And Maggie Makes 3 that has stayed with people for 30 years. The episode is structured as a flashback. Homer is telling the story of how Maggie came to be born, and the story involves him finally quitting the nuclear plant to work his dream job at a bowling alley, only to have to go back to Mr. Burns and beg for his old job when Marge becomes pregnant a third time. Burns, in an act of deliberate humiliation, puts a sign above Homer's workstation that reads, "Do not forget, you are here forever." The episode ends in the present day with Homer showing the family where he keeps his photos of Maggie. He has placed them over the letters on the sign, so it now reads, "Do it for her." That moment costs nothing to describe and everything to watch. It works because the show spent the entire episode building the specific weight that the final image needed to carry. The weight of a man who gave up what he wanted, who works a job he hates under a boss who despises him, who has structured the place where he spends most of his waking life around a reminder of why he is doing it. It is not a big moment. Homer does not make a speech. The episode does not explain what the image means, it just shows it and trusts the audience to feel it. That trust, the show's willingness to build something carefully and then deliver it without explanation, was the emotional engine of the Golden Age, and understanding what happened to it as the seasons went on is essential to understanding the full scale of what the show lost. The Golden Age of The Simpsons was built on emotional stakes that were real, not dramatic in the way that prestige television is dramatic. Nobody died in most episodes, nobody's life was permanently destroyed, the status quo was generally restored by the end of each half hour. But real in a more important way, the feelings that the episodes produced were connected to actual human experiences that the audience recognized. The fear of disappointing a parent, the specific grief of watching a mother leave, the quiet dignity of a man who loves his family more than he loves himself. These were not invented for dramatic effect. They were the show looking at real life and finding the truth in it and putting that truth on screen in a way that comedy could carry. Season 2 produced Lisa's Substitute, in which a temporary teacher named Mr. Bergstrom treats Lisa as a person worth taking seriously at a moment when almost nobody in her life is doing that. When he leaves, the loss she feels is real. The specific, disproportionate grief of a child losing a connection that mattered to them in a way they cannot fully explain to adults who did not see it. The episode does not resolve this grief neatly. Mr. Bergstrom writes her a note that tells her who she is, and she reads it, and the episode ends. The show does not tell you she is going to be fine. It trusts you to understand that the note is not a cure for loneliness, but it is something she can keep, something that is true even after the person who said it is gone. Season 7 produced Mother Simpson, which ends with Homer sitting alone on the hood of his car in the dark after watching his mother disappear again. He says nothing. The episode does not comfort him, it just lets him sit there, and lets the audience sit with him, and the silence is exactly right because there is nothing to say. His mother came back and then she had to leave, and the feeling of that, the specific irreducible sadness of a second loss after you thought the first one was the only one you would have to survive, does not need to be explained. Both of these moments work for the same reason. The show had spent the episodes building toward them through the accumulation of specific, true details about specific, true people. The emotional payoff was earned because the emotional work had been done. The audience felt something because the show had given them something real to feel it about. This is what the later seasons progressively stopped doing. The shift was not sudden. It happened the same way all of the other changes happened, gradually. through a series of small decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation and whose cumulative effect only became visible over time. An episode that chose a big comedic premise over a grounded emotional one, a storyline that prioritized the plot's entertainment value over its emotional honesty, a character moment that was played for laughs when it could have been played for truth. Each of these choices was defensible on its own. Together, season by season, they added up to a show that had stopped believing its own characters were worth taking seriously. By the time the show was deep into the Al Jean era, the emotional architecture that had defined the Golden Age was largely gone. Episodes still occasionally attempted emotional moments, the form was still there, the structure of a story building toward a feeling was still recognizable, but the feelings themselves were not landing the way they once had. Critics and fans who tried to articulate why often landed on the same description, the later emotional moments felt manufactured. They felt like the show going through the motions of caring rather than actually caring. The difference between a manufactured emotional moment and a real one is difficult to describe but immediately recognizable when you feel it. A real one arrives because everything before it has been building toward it. Every character choice, every story decision, every specific detail has been aimed at this moment without the audience necessarily knowing that. A manufactured one arrives because the episode needs a feeling now, because 20 minutes have passed and it is time for the story to mean something. And so a character says something meaningful, or a piece of familiar music plays and the show waits for the audience to respond. The audience stopped responding. Not all at once and not completely. The later seasons did occasionally produce genuine emotional moments that reminded longtime viewers of what the show had been capable of. But those moments were exceptions praised specifically as exceptions, described by the people who noticed them as feeling like the old show again, which is itself a kind of verdict on everything surrounding them. The Simpsons movie, released in 2007, is worth examining in this context because it represented the show's most ambitious attempt in years to produce emotional stakes at scale. The film's central story involves Homer's selfishness, putting the entire family and eventually all of Springfield in danger, and its resolution requires Homer to genuinely choose his family over himself in a way that costs him something. The film works better than most of the episodes surrounding it in the timeline, and a significant part of the reason is that it was given the time and the resources to build toward its emotional moments properly. The relationship between Homer and Bart, which had been one of the show's most consistently rich sources of genuine feeling in the Golden Age and had been reduced to a running gag in the later seasons, is given space in the film to breathe and develop and produce something real. The moment where Bart tells Homer that he wished Flanders was his father lands because the film has earned it. The film grossed over $527 million worldwide. Critics noted that it captured something of the show's earlier quality. The episodes that followed it across subsequent seasons largely did not sustain what the film had briefly recovered. The film had demonstrated that the capacity was still there somewhere. The weekly production schedule, the same writer's room, the same structural pressures that had produced the drift in the first place, all of that reasserted itself and the later seasons continued as before. What the loss of emotional stakes ultimately produced was a show that was technically still a comedy, but had lost its reason for being one. The Golden Age had been funny because it was true. The humor came from the specific, precise observation of real human behavior. The way Homer's face looks when he realizes he has made a mistake he cannot fix. The way Lisa's voice sounds when she is trying to be brave about something that is genuinely hurting her. The way Marge absorbs difficulty with a quiet suffering that is more honest about marriage than most dramas manage to be. The comedy lived inside the truth. You laughed because you recognized something, and the recognition was the point. When the truth left, the comedy became something else. Faster, louder, more disconnected, working harder to generate responses from an audience that had less and less to recognize in what it was watching. The jokes kept coming. The show kept producing them at the same rate it always had. They just had less underneath them. The hollow feeling that viewers described when trying to articulate what was wrong with the later seasons was not about any specific episode being bad. It was about all of them together adding up to less than they should, a sum that felt smaller than its parts because the parts were no longer connected to anything essential. Homer sitting on the hood of his car in the dark, Maggie's photos covering the letters of a sign, a substitute teacher writing 4 words on a piece of paper and changing a child's understanding of herself. These moments are not famous because they are dramatic, they are famous because they are true, and the show was brave enough to trust that truth was enough, that bravery cost something to maintain, and as the seasons went on, the show stopped paying the cost. Quote _9 __ the competition problem, the arrival of South Park, Family Guy, and other animated shows that forced The Simpsons to respond to a changed landscape, played a real role in accelerating this loss. Understanding exactly how that competition changed what the show was willing to be and what it drove the writers' room to do in response is where the story of the decline connects to something larger than any single season or any single decision. Section 11, Competition and the Identity Crisis, Family Guy, South Park, and the show that lost its voice. When The Simpsons premiered in 1989, it had no competition. There was nothing else on American television that looked like it, sounded like it, or attempted what it was attempting. Animated shows for adults had existed before, but not like this, not at this level of writing, not with this kind of ambition about what a cartoon could say about real life. The show invented its own category and then occupied it alone for nearly a decade. That solitude was not just comfortable, it was creatively liberating. When you are the only show doing what you do not have to look over your shoulder. You just do it. By the late 1990s, the solitude was over. South Park premiered on Comedy Central in August 1997. The same year, Mike Scully took over as showrunner of The Simpsons. It was created by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, who had grown up watching The Simpsons and absorbed its lessons about what animated comedy could do. South Park was cruder than The Simpsons had ever been, more deliberately provocative, more willing to be offensive in ways that the earlier show had generally avoided. But underneath the crudeness was something sharp and fast and genuinely surprising. A show that could respond to a current event within days of it happening and put it on screen before the cultural conversation had moved on. That speed was not an accident. South Park's production model was built around a 6-day turnaround from concept to finished episode in less than a week. Parker and Stone developed the ability to write, voice, animate, and deliver a complete episode in that window, which meant the show could be genuinely topical in a way that The Simpsons, with its production timeline of several months, could never match. An episode of The Simpsons that was written in response to a current event would air months after the event itself, by which point the audience had largely forgotten the specific details that made the reference meaningful. South Park could air the response while the audience was still talking about the event. This was a structural disadvantage for The Simpsons that no amount of good writing could fully overcome. The show's satirical advantage, the thing that had made episodes like Marge versus the Monorail or Last Exit to Springfield feel so alive and so precise, depended partly on the show's ability to observe the world clearly and comment on what it saw. When a newer show could do that observation faster, more directly, and with less institutional caution, the older show's satirical currency began to depreciate. Family Guy premiered on Fox in January 1999, one network over from The Simpsons and directly competing for the same Sunday night audience. Its creator, Seth MacFarlane, had grown up watching The Simpsons, and the influence was unmistakable. Griffin family versus Simpson family, bumbling father figure, long-suffering wife, precocious child. But Family Guy was doing something structurally different with its comedy. Where The Simpsons had built jokes out of character and story, where the humor was inseparable from who these people were and what was happening to them, Family Guy built jokes through disconnection. The cutaway gag became its signature. The story would stop, a character would reference something, and the show would cut to a completely separate comedic scene with no connection to the plot. The joke existed in isolation. It did not require the story to earn it. This format was immediately successful with a certain audience. Family Guy was canceled by Fox after its second season due to low ratings, then revived in 2005 after DVD sales and strong performance in reruns demonstrated that a devoted audience existed for it. After its revival, it became one of Fox's most reliable performers. The success of Family Guy's disconnected, cutaway-driven comedy format created a template that other shows would follow, and created pressure on The Simpsons to respond to it. The response visible across the later seasons of The Simpsons was not conscious imitation. Nobody in the writers' room announced they were going to make the show more like Family Guy, but the competitive pressure of sharing an audience with a show that operated differently produced a gradual drift towards some of Family Guy's tendencies: faster joke delivery, less investment in story architecture, more willingness to sacrifice character consistency for an immediate laugh. The show that had been defined by its integration of comedy and character began producing more moments where the comedy was delivered at the expense of character, where the laugh was chosen over the truth. One community analysis from within the Simpsons fan world described the competitive response in the plainest possible terms. The show was dumbed down and made more Homer-centered because the writers believed they needed to compete with shows like South Park and Family Guy by becoming louder and more focused on immediate entertainment. Whether that was a conscious strategic decision or a natural drift driven by the changed environment around the show, the result was visible in the episodes. The Simpsons was becoming more like its competitors rather than remaining the thing that its competitors had been trying to imitate. King of the Hill, which also premiered in 1997 on Fox, presented a different kind of competition. Quieter, more grounded, less willing to reach for outrageous comedy than either South Park or Family Guy. Created by Mike Judge and Greg Daniels, and Daniels had written for The Simpsons during its golden age before leaving to work on other projects, King of the Hill was in some ways a deliberate return to the kind of grounded, character-driven animated comedy that The Simpsons had pioneered and then moved away from. It ran for 13 seasons and was consistently praised for the honesty and warmth of its character work. Its existence was a quiet argument that the audience for grounded animated storytelling had not disappeared. It was just not being served by The Simpsons anymore. The Simpsons had created the category that all of these shows were now operating in. It had demonstrated that animated comedy for adults could be sophisticated, emotionally honest, and genuinely important as television. The shows that followed it into that space had learned from it and then pushed in different directions, and the combined effect of their presence had changed what the landscape expected from animated comedy. South Park was faster and more provocative. Family Guy was more disconnected and more willing to be purely absurdist. Both of them had audiences that were, in some respects, audiences the older show had trained, audiences who had grown up watching The Simpsons and had then moved on to shows that offered something the later seasons of The Simpsons no longer provided. The pressure of this competition intersected with the production problems already documented: the static writer's room, the Flanderized characters, the declining emotional stakes, to produce a specific kind of creative paralysis. The show was caught between what it had been and what the new competitive environment seemed to demand. Moving toward Family Guy's disconnected comedy format meant abandoning the character-driven structure that had defined the golden age. Moving toward South Park's topical speed meant acknowledging a structural limitation the show could not overcome. Staying exactly where it was meant continuing to produce a version of itself that was neither what it had been at its best nor what any of the newer shows were doing well. The choice the show made, largely through inaction rather than deliberate decision, was the third option. It continued producing a version of itself that looked like The Simpsons from the outside. Same family, same town, same format, while the interior had shifted enough that long-term viewers could feel the difference even when they could not fully articulate it. The show retained its brand while losing the thing that had made the brand worth having. There is a specific and well-documented moment that illustrates how clearly the show understood its own competitive situation. In Season 8, an episode called The Itchy and Scratchy and Poochie Show was built entirely around the premise of a television network trying to revive a flagging cartoon by adding a new character, a Poochie, who had been focus grouped and test marketed to appeal to a younger, hipper audience. Poochie was deliberately terrible. The episode was the show explicitly mocking the kind of cynical, audience-chasing creative decision that networks made when a show lost its way. A network character asks whether the new character should have an attitude, and is told that attitude means attitude, then is told to add more attitude. The episode ends with Poochie being killed off and a character announcing that Poochie went back to his home planet. Roy, another new character introduced in the same episode as a joke about network notes, demanding a new young character to attract teen viewers, appeared for the length of the joke and was never seen again. The episode was praised as sharp, self-aware satire. It aired in Season 8 at the tail end of the Golden Age. Within a few seasons, the show was making the exact kinds of decisions it had spent that episode mocking, chasing celebrities for their audience appeal, building episodes around topical references designed to signal relevance, prioritizing immediate entertainment over the character integrity it had once protected so carefully. The distance between the show that made the Itchy and Scratchy and Poochie show and the show that made Lisa Goes Gaga is the distance between a creative team that understood its own principles clearly enough to satirize the forces threatening them, and a creative team that had been worn down by those same forces long enough that the principles were no longer available to defend. South Park remains on the air. Family Guy remains on the air. King of the Hill was revived after years off the air because the audience for it had not disappeared. The Simpsons remains on the air. All of them are still producing episodes. But among those shows, only one of them had been, at its peak, the most important piece of television in America. The show that the President of the United States felt the need to publicly criticize. The show that gave a generation its most honest mirror of what family and work and ambition actually looked like in real life. That show still exists in form. Exists. What it was at its best exists only in the early seasons, available on demand, watched by an audience that chooses them freely over everything the show has made since. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final chapter of The Simpsons story is not about competition or writers' rooms or character changes. It is about what happens to a show when all of those things compound over long enough, when the institution outlives the quality that justified the institution, and the question of whether it should continue becomes less about what it is and more about what it was. That question has been hanging over Springfield for 20 years. The numbers have been answering it season by season in the only language that the people keeping the show on the air are required to hear. Section 12, the zombie era, what that the show became after it stopped dying. The Simpsons movie opened in July 2007. It had been in development for years. The project had been discussed, started, abandoned, and restarted so many times across the show's history that a running joke inside the production was that it would never actually get made. When it finally arrived in theaters, it drew audiences who had grown up with the show, who had moved through their teenage years and into adulthood watching Springfield, and who showed up to see whether the big screen could give them back something the weekly episodes had been unable to provide for years. The film cost approximately $75 million to make. It earned over $527 million worldwide. By any measure available, it was a significant success, proof that the audience for The Simpsons, at sufficient scale and with sufficient effort applied to the material, still existed and was still capable of responding. Critics noted that the film recaptured something of the show's earlier quality. The relationship between Homer and Bart, which had been one of the Golden Age's richest emotional sources and had since been reduced to a repetitive dynamic, was given space in the film to develop into something real. The moment where Bart tells Homer he wishes Ned Flanders were his father lands with genuine force, because the film earns it through patient, careful construction of the kind the weekly episodes had long since stopped attempting. The film was, in the most optimistic reading of events, a demonstration that the capability was still there. The people involved could still make something worth watching when given enough time, enough budget, and enough collective will to hold the standard. The question the film's success raised, loudly, clearly, in a way that was impossible to ignore, was why the weekly episodes could not achieve even a fraction of what the film had managed. The answer the production gave in the form of what followed was not encouraging. The seasons after the film continued along the same path the show had been traveling before it. The brief critical recovery the film represented did not translate into a sustained improvement in the episodes surrounding it. The writer's room returned to its routines, the characters continued in their simplified forms, the viewership continued its long decline. Season 34 averaged 1.83 million viewers. Season 35 averaged 1.74 million. The film had shown what the show could still do. The episodes showed what it chose to do instead. By this point in the show's history, the question of whether The Simpsons was still good had largely been replaced by a different question. Why was it still on at all? The answer to that question had almost nothing to do with the quality of individual episodes and almost everything to do with the institutional and commercial value of The Simpsons as a property, as a brand, as a licensing platform, as a piece of intellectual property whose logo and characters appeared on merchandise, theme park attractions, and promotional materials around the world. Fox had acquired the show in its earliest days and built its entire network identity partly around it. The Simpsons was the show that had put Fox on the map as a legitimate broadcast network in the early 1990s, when the network was still young and still fighting for credibility against the established giants. The show's first season was the first Fox program ever to rank among the top 30 highest-rated shows in a season. Fox owed the show a debt that was not purely financial, and the institutional relationship between the network and the series had calcified over decades into something that neither side had any obvious interest in ending. Fox merged with Disney in a deal that closed in 2019, and The Simpsons became part of the Disney portfolio alongside Marvel, Star Wars, and Pixar. The show began producing short films for Disney Plus that tied Springfield characters into the Marvel and Star Wars universes, shorts that were not essential viewing for anyone, that most fans of the show treated as curiosities rather than real content, but that served a commercial purpose in the larger Disney ecosystem by connecting the show's characters to Disney's biggest properties. The transition to Disney Plus as a genuine home for new Simpsons content accelerated when the season 36 Christmas special was released exclusively on the streaming platform, bypassing Fox's broadcast network entirely. This was described in coverage at the time as a sign of things to come, that the show would gradually migrate from weekly broadcast television to the streaming platform, where its legacy value and its enormous back catalog could serve as an anchor for subscribers rather than a weekly ratings performer on a network where it was drawing fewer than 2 million viewers per episode. The streaming migration made a certain kind of sense from a business perspective. On Disney Plus, The Simpsons existed alongside its entire history. All 30-plus seasons available on demand, the golden age sitting next to the most recent episodes in a library that a subscriber could move through freely. The show's value on that platform was not primarily the new episodes, it was the archive. It was seasons 3 through 8 available whenever anyone wanted them, generating viewing time and maintaining subscriber engagement with content that had been produced decades earlier and would continue generating that engagement indefinitely. This is, in the plainest terms, the definition of a property that has outlived its creative period and is now being sustained by the work done during that creative period. The Simpsons in its current form exists partly so that The Simpsons in its golden form can continue to be commercially relevant. The new episodes justify the continued existence of the brand. The brand justifies the continued streaming of the old episodes. The old episodes are the thing people actually want. The new episodes are the price of maintaining access to them. Al Jean stepped down as showrunner after over 2 decades, with Matt Selman taking over as the show's sole showrunner. The transition happened without significant public announcement, a change in the leadership of one of the longest-running shows in television history, noted briefly in entertainment reporting and then largely absorbed into the general background noise of a show that had been running for so long that even significant changes to its production were processed as routine. Selman had been part of the show's writing staff since 19 1997, more than 25 years, and his ascension to sole showrunner represented continuity rather than renewal. The room had not changed in any fundamental way. A second Simpsons movie has been announced. The first film had succeeded by giving the creative team the time and resources to build something more carefully than the weekly schedule allowed. The second film will face the question of whether that same team, working with characters who have been simplified and reduced across 30-plus additional seasons since the first film, can recover the emotional weight that made the first film work. The announcement generated coverage. Whether it generated genuine excitement among the people who grew up with the show is a harder thing to measure. The show that George H.W. Bush attacked in 1992 because it represented an honest picture of American family life that made him uncomfortable. That show drew over 33 million viewers for a single episode. The show that exists now draws fewer than 2 million viewers per week. The distance between those numbers is not just a ratings story. It is the entire arc of a creative institution, from something urgent and specific and true about what it felt like to be alive in America, to something institutional and familiar and comfortable, producing episodes that are technically The Simpsons without being what The Simpsons was when it mattered most. The word that has been used most consistently to describe the show in its current era is zombie, a show that is technically still alive, still moving, still producing, but that lost whatever animated it somewhere along the way and has been running on institutional momentum ever since. The zombie metaphor is not kind, but it is not entirely unfair. A zombie retains the shape of what it was. It goes through the motions of the behaviors it had when it was alive. It does not know it has changed. It does not know anything is missing. It keeps moving because stopping is not something it knows how to do. The Simpsons has not stopped. After 35 seasons and over 750 episodes, it continues to produce new content every year, to attract celebrity voices, to reference current events, to put the familiar yellow family through new scenarios in the familiar yellow town. It continues to exist. What it no longer does, what it has not consistently done for the better part of 3 decades, is make the audience feel something true about their own lives. That was the original promise of Springfield. That was what Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa offered to the people who watched them in the early 1990s. Not entertainment as a distraction from life, but entertainment as a reflection of it. Honest, specific, sometimes painful, always recognizable. The Golden Age episodes are still there. They always will be. And the fact that they are still being actively chosen by viewers who have every other season available to them at the same time is the final permanent verdict on everything the show has been and everything it became. Not a verdict delivered by critics or analysts or fan communities, but by the audience itself, making free choices about what to watch every single day. They keep choosing season 5. They keep choosing season 7. They keep choosing the show that existed before the writers left, before the characters simplified, before the stakes disappeared, before the competition changed what the show thought it needed to be. That choice is not nostalgia. Nostalgia is a feeling about the past. What those viewers are choosing is something better than the present. And a show that is 35 seasons old and still has its best work in its first 8 seasons is not a show that aged well. It is a show that had something extraordinary and lost it and kept going anyway, which is its own kind of story and not an entirely happy one. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.